The Hound of the Baskervilles. Before we begin tonight's story, let me offer you a gentle introduction, especially if you've never read the tales of Sherlock Holmes before. This is not just another detective story. It's not about fast chases, loud confrontations, or theatrical villains. This is a slow, burning mystery, wrapped in fog and silence, where every glance, every footprint, and every whisper. Sherlock Holmes, the famous London detective known for his sharp mind and quiet intensity, doesn't rely on luck or coincidence. He relies on observation, on logic, on human nature. And tonight's story is one of his most haunting cases, set far away from the busy streets of London, deep within the wild, windswept moors of Devonshire. This is a tale that blends fact with legend, science with superstition, a story where fear itself becomes a character. You don't need to know Holmes's past adventures. All you need is a quiet, a bit of a and a willingness to walk with him into the mist. So, make yourself comfortable. Let the world slow down around you. Let your breathing deepen, and prepare to follow a trail where reason and fear walk side by side. What if I told you that one man's fear could kill him, that footsteps heard in an empty hallway could mean more than they seem, and that a shadow moving through the fog might not be a shadow at all? This is a story about a legend, about an ancient curse said to hunt a single family for generations. But more than that, it's a story about a hound larger than any natural beast, eyes said to glow like fire, breath like smoke, and a growl that makes even the strongest heart hesitate. Is it a ghost, a trick of the mind, or something worse, something planned by human hands? You'll have to stay with me until the end, because in the moors of Dartmoor, truth and fear wear the same face. And tonight, Sherlock Holmes will prove which one is real. The morning mist clung to the windows of 221B Baker Street like a breath held against glass, softening the shapes beyond. London, even in its waking hours, seemed hushed, as if reluctant to fully emerge from sleep. Carriages passed now and then the street below, their wheels cutting through puddles left from the night's drizzle. But inside the flat, time had slowed to a thoughtful quiet. Dr. John Watson sat alone in the sitting room, wrapped in his dressing gown, sipping gently from a cup of. The scent of bergamot lingered in the air, mixing with faint traces of pipe smoke and the old paper of well-thumbed books. The fireplace flickered with a tame fire, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Holmes was not there that morning. He had set out early, following a thread of curiosity through the alleyways of Wapping, in what he called a promisingly trivial burglary. Watson had stayed behind, enjoying but something unexpected had drawn his attention. On the corner table near the window sat a walking stick. It was elegant in its simplicity, walnut, dark, and finely grained, with a rounded ivory-capped handle. The wood bore subtle scuffs and polished patches, telling of regular use, not ostentation. This was the kind of item a man carried every day, not to display wealth, but because it fit naturally in his hand, a tool of habit, reliable, familiar. He picked it up and turned it slowly in the soft light. It was heavier than it looked, solid, balanced. Its craftsmanship spoke of quality, but also of sentiment. Just below the handle was a brass plate, worn slightly from fingers gripping too tightly, too often. The inscription was short but telling. To James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the C.C.H. Watson's mind began to turn, gently, not in urgency, the comfort of familiar thought. The initials M.R.C.S., member of the Royal College of Surgeons, marked the man as a trained medical professional. C.C.H., likely Charing Cross Hospital. So this was a parting gift, perhaps, from his colleagues, a gesture of respect and camaraderie. Doctors, especially those in long service, rarely earned such tokens without deep trust from their peers. Watson leaned back in the chair and studied the stick again. The wear on the base was uneven. The rubber tip, long since worn through, had been replaced by a small iron ferrule, scratched and chipped from long walks. This man did not stroll gently through city parks. He walked, seriously, perhaps through gravel roads or forest paths. He imagined a countryside, open and raw, with the wind cutting across fields, maybe moorland. His coat would be thick, his eyes accustomed to wide horizons, and not to the soot-covered brick of London's skyline. Watson smiled to himself. A country doctor, he murmured, pleased with the conclusion. Perhaps middle-aged, practical, reliable. The kind of man who treated farmers and shepherds, not politicians. He pictured a long face, a quiet voice, the scent of earth still clinging to his boots. The door creaked downstairs. A voice, Mrs. Hudson's, floated up faintly, speaking to someone in the entryway. Watson turned his head slightly, listening, but no reply reached him. Then, silence again. The walking stick remained the only clue to a visitor's presence. No name left, no note. Just this weighty token, rich with character and oddly deliberate in its abandonment. Watson set the stick down and poured himself another cup of tea. Rain ticked lightly against the window glass. He leaned back, let the warmth of the drink settle into him, and allowed the quiet to continue. Time passed, then footsteps. He recognized them immediately, measured, purposeful, and lightly impatient. Holmes. The front door opened and closed. A moment later, the familiar figure appeared at the sitting room door, coat damp, scarf loosened, gloves tucked beneath one arm. Sherlock Holmes looked not the least surprised to see Watson, awake and waiting. "Found something interesting, have you?" Holmes said, his gaze falling instantly on the walking stick. Watson nodded. "Our visitor has good taste, at the very least. Solid walnut, medical man, country, possibly middle-aged, seems to prefer his own company." Holmes stepped forward and took the stick into his hands. He turned it slowly, his sharp eyes scanning every groove, mark, and imperfection in silence. "James Mortimer," he said, reading the inscription aloud. "Royal College of Surgeons, Charing Cross Hospital. You've deduced well, Watson. He's a doctor, but not as old as you think." He pointed to a series of small notches along the shaft, low to the base. "See these? Not the pattern of age. That's from hurried walking, long strides over uneven ground, likely the moor. He walks fast and often. A younger man's habit. Older men stop more. This one paces." Watson leaned forward slightly, listening. Holmes continued, "And here, just at the ivory handle, do you notice that scuff?" Watson nodded. "A bite," Holmes said. "A small one, likely from a dog. A terrier, judging by the width and angle, an excitable dog. Our Dr. Mortimer is not only a walker but has a companion. Possibly allows the dog to carry or tug at the stick. A fond relationship, or at least familiar." He set the stick gently back on the table and turned to the window. "And the fact that he left it tells us he meant to return." Watson raised an eyebrow. "A deliberate calling card?" Holmes nodded once. "Exactly that." As if on cue, a firm knock echoed from downstairs. Mrs. Hudson called up from the entry. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped to the door and replied evenly, "Send him up." Watson sat up straighter as the footsteps approached. A moment later, the door opened slowly, and in stepped a tall, lean man in a dark coat. His features were narrow, almost fox-like, with thin lips and a long, angular nose. His hair was swept back and just beginning to gray at the temples. He carried under one arm a small, wrapped bundle, secured tightly in a linen cloth. "Dr. James Mortimer," he said quietly but with clarity. "I believe I left my stick." Holmes gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. "And we've been admiring it in your absence. Please, take a seat." Mortimer did so, settling into the chair with a careful motion. He glanced briefly at Watson, then at the stick, then back at Holmes. "I have come to you," he began, "because I am a man of science, and I find myself facing something that science cannot account for." He placed the bundle on his lap and began to unwrap it, slowly and with an almost reverent care. Linen layers unfolded, revealing a single sheet of parchment, aged, yellow, and creased with time. Holmes did not speak. He simply watched, still and silent, as Dr. Mortimer smoothed the document across his knees and cleared his throat. "This," Mortimer said softly, "has been passed down in one family for generations. It is a private account, a warning, they say. And though I have never been a man to place stock in some, recent events have shaken my confidence in what I know and what I do." The fire crackled gently. A faint whistle of wind sounded outside, brushing past the windows. London continued its endless motion beyond the wall, but inside that quiet room, something ancient was being prepared to, and in the hush that followed, the story of the hound was about to be. The linen bundle rested on Dr. Mortimer's knees like a relic pulled from some sacred vault. In the quiet flicker of the firelight, his hands moved carefully, unfolding each layer as though he feared disturbing whatever slept. The faint smell of aged began to rise, a dry, delicate, like old books, and neither Holmes nor Watson. The weight of the moment seemed to press inward, softening the room around. Outside, the city remained distant and muffled behind fog-drenched glass. All that remained here was the hush of anticipation, the creak of leather as Mortimer shifted slightly in his chair, and the slow, reverent breath he drew before speaking. "This document," he said at last in a voice low and steady, "has remained in the possession of the Baskerville family for over 2 centuries. It was written by a man named Richard Baskerville sometime in the latter part of the 17th century. He was, by all accounts, a sober-minded individual, though deeply affected by what he witnessed." He paused and looked at the parchment now smoothed across his lap. The handwriting was old-fashioned, tight, the ink faded, but still legible. Mortimer traced one of the lines with his finger, then began to read aloud. Holmes leaned back, folding his hand his chin. Watson sat forward slightly, elbow on the armrest, his attention drawn not only to the story, but to the man telling it. Mortimer's voice had shifted. It was no longer clinical or hesitant. It had become something else, careful, solemn, touched by an unease he could not conceal. "In the time of the Great Plague," Mortimer began, "there lived at Baskerville Hall a man named Sir Hugo Baskerville, of infamous character and violent temper. His heart, if such it could be called, was bent toward cruelty, his appetites unrestrained. It was said that no servant obeyed him from loyalty, only from fear. No neighbor welcomed his presence, but rather endured it in silence, and no woman dared cross his path without risking her dignity or her safety." Watson's brow furrowed. The language, though antiquated, carried a weight beyond simple folklore. It wasn't just the story of a wicked man. It was a warning. "One night," Mortimer continued, "Sir Hugo became taken with the daughter of a yeoman who lived nearby. The girl was said to be modest and gentle, and Hugo, in his arrogance, set about claiming her as if she were game to be hunted. He had her seized by force, carried to the hall, and locked in a chamber on the upper floor. A log shifted in the hearth, cracking. The flame hissed. That night, while Hugo and his guests drank and caroused in the dining hall, the girl escaped her window and fled barefoot into the moor. A wild wind rose that evening, and the land was cloaked in mist. When Sir Hugo discovered her absence, he flew into a rage and swore by unholy oaths that he would find her and drag her back himself." Mortimer's eyes lifted from the page briefly, as though gauging whether he should continue. Holmes gave no indication. He merely watched. 3 companions rode out with him. They loosed the hounds and galloped across the moor. They said Sir Hugo had madness in his eyes and foam on his lips. The dogs tracked her easily at first, but then he paused. Then the hounds grew afraid. A silence settled again. Even Watson, who had heard far stranger tales in his time with Holmes, felt something cold shift inside him. When the 3 gentlemen caught up, they found the girl's body at the edge of a ravine. She had died from fear and exhaustion, but near her, upon a patch of flattened grass, lay Sir Hugo, his throat torn open, and standing over him, so the account goes, was an enormous black hound, larger than any known breed. Its eyes glowed in the dark, steamed in the air like... Mortimer let the words hang in the air a long moment before folding the parchment gently. There are those, quieter, who claim the beast vanished before their eyes. Others say it turned and fled into the moor, but none who saw it ever doubted that they had witnessed something unnatural. From that day on, the family spoke only in whispers of the curse, for it was said that when a male heir returned to the hall, the hound would follow. Holmes exhaled softly, his expression unreadable. He tapped a finger against his lip, then reached for his pipe without a word. Watson finally spoke, his voice calm but direct. "You don't believe the creature was real." Mortimer looked at him steadily. "I believe something happened. I believe that fear can take root, grow in a place like the moor, and pass down through blood like a sickness. I also believe that something killed Sir Charles Baskerville not 2 weeks ago, and I don't think it was just his heart." Now Holmes looked up. "Tell us what happened, Mortimer." Sir Charles was not a superstitious man, not in the modern sense, but he was deeply aware of his family's history. Over the past year, he had grown increasingly. He avoided the moor at night. He altered his habits. He asked me often about his health. I advised him to rest more, to travel, but he insisted on remaining at Baskerville Hall. He paused, his voice tightening. "I found him dead near the yew gate, just beyond. He often walked there alone, before retiring. There were no signs of violence on his body, only the expression on his face. I had never seen such a look. It was as though he had seen something so terrible that his heart gave out in fright." And frowned. "And the prints?" Mortimer's eyes darkened. "I did not report them to the coroner. No one would have taken me seriously, but they were there, impossibly large, clear in the soft earth." Holmes had remained silent, but his eyes were moving again, calculating, turning over possibilities. "You believe this hound still stalks the Baskerville line?" Mortimer nodded. "Sir Henry arrives tomorrow from Canada. He is the last of them. I do not know if there is a beast, but something is killing the men of that family. Whether by paw or by fear, I cannot say, but it is real, and I fear it will strike again." The fire flared softly. The parchment lay once more wrapped in its linen, resting now on the small table near Holmes. Dr. Mortimer sat forward, hands clasped. "I did not come for ghost stories. I came for answers. And if there are any men alive who might untangle truth from myth, it is the 2 of you." For a moment no one spoke. Then Holmes stood and walked slowly to the window. The fog still lay thick across Baker Street. Beyond it, the city turned beneath a gray sky, unaware that in a single quiet room, a centuries-old shadow had just stirred once more. Even in the soft firelight of Baker Street, the name Baskerville seemed to echo longer than expected. Holmes had not spoken since Dr. Mortimer finished recounting the legend. The physician, now seated quietly across from the hearth, seemed smaller somehow, less eccentric than he had first appeared. His hands, long and bony, were folded with care atop his knee. The tension in his face had settled into something deeper, quieter, a blend of worry and guilt. Watson, too, had fallen into reflection. The old manuscript now returned to its linen shroud, lay untouched on the side table. The strange tale of Hugo Baskerville and the spectral hound still lingered in the air, not because it was believable, but because someone had died under its shadow. Holmes finally stirred. He reached for his pipe, lit it with a match struck from the mantel, and exhaled. The smoke curled toward the ceiling like a thought still forming. You were Sir Charles's personal physician, not as a question, as a quiet fact. I was, for over 5 years. Then I assume you were well acquainted with his temperament. Yes, Mortimer said. He was a kind man, modest, not without his habits, but his decency was well known even among the poorest tenants in the parish. He was generous with his money and cautious with his health, perhaps too cautious in the end. Holmes looked toward the window. Outside, the fog still pressed against the glass, turning the familiar world into ghostly forms. Then, with measured calm, he asked, "Tell us exactly what happened, from the beginning." Mortimer nodded slowly and shifted in his seat. His voice was lower now, as if the very telling of it required a different register, something quieter, more respectful of the dead. "Baskerville Hall," he began, "is set at the edge of Dartmoor, just beyond the ancient trees of Yew Alley. The land there is heavy with mist, even in summer. The air tastes of peat and moss. And beyond it all, stretching out for miles, lies the Grimpen Mire, a place few dare walk without absolute familiarity. Watson as Mortimer, a house half swallowed by the moor, surrounded by silence and wet earth that remembered every. Sir Charles lived alone, Mortimer. He kept an elderly couple named Barrymore, who served faithfully. He rarely entertained guests. After his wife passed, he preferred. But over time, I began to notice a change. Holmes said nothing, but Watson leaned slightly forward. Mortimer's eyes dropped to the fire. At first it was subtle. He became hesitant about walking alone. He insisted the Barrymores lock every door by sundown. Then came the inquiries, asking me about hereditary illness, the effects of fear on the heart, old myths of the moor. I tried to reassure him, but he was, how can I put it, waiting for something, or fearing it. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did he ever speak of the legend directly? Mortimer nodded once. He believed the curse had merit, not in a supernatural sense necessarily, but he believed that something, whatever it was, had followed his family for generations. He thought he had been spared for a time, but not forever. Watson felt a chill along the back of his neck. It was the kind of quiet dread that builds not from loud declarations, but from a man's quiet certainty that his days are numbered. He told me he would not walk beyond the house after dark. He had stopped riding altogether. He'd even begun planning changes to his will, urgent one. And then, one evening, he didn't return from his usual stroll. Holmes lowered his pipe. What time did he leave the house? Sometime after 10. He often walked down the Yew Alley before bed, said it helped him that night, and out alone. The Barrymores heard the door close, but he left no message, no word of when he'd be back. Watson asked, "And when was he found?" "Just before midnight," Mortimer. Barrymore grew concerned and took a lantern into the alley. He found Sir Charles lying near the far gate, face up, eyes wide. It had rained lightly that day, so the ground was soft. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no struggle. But his expression. Mortimer stopped, visibly unsettled. He looked as though he had died. No one spoke for a. Then Holmes, very quietly, asked, "What did the official examination determine?" "I conducted it myself. There was no sign of foul play. His heart was weakened from age and strain. The conclusion was natural failure, though accelerated by no shock. He had been dead less than half an hour." Holmes stood and walked to the desk, his hands behind. He stared down at a blank sheet of paper as if it might begin writing on its own. "And the footprints?" Mortimer looked down. "They were not mentioned in the inquest. I did not think it wise, but I saw them myself, a few feet away from the body, clear, fresh, unmistakable, the prints of a very large dog. Holmes remained still. Then he turned, and were they on the path or off it? Off the path, on the turf, at the edge of the... Holmes nodded faintly, storing the detail. Then he asked the next question, without changing his tone. And was anything else unusual found near the body? Mortimer hesitated. Yes. Ash. Ash? Yes, he confirmed. Sir Charles smoked cigars. He always carried a few in his coat. When I examined him, one lay near his right hand, only slightly burned. It suggested he had paused, perhaps stood there for some time, not walking, just waiting or listening. Holmes turned and paced slowly toward the window, the silence lengthening with each footfall. Then he spoke again, this time more to himself than to the room. So, we have a man of rational habits, suddenly overtaken by private fears. He avoids the moor at night, yet feels safe enough to walk alone. He pauses at the edge of his property, stands still long enough to light a cigar, then dies, not of violence, but of terror. And beside him, the trace of something with paws too large for any ordinary breed. He turned back to Mortimer. And you say the heir arrives tomorrow? Yes, Mortimer's. Sir Henry Baskerville is arriving at Waterloo Station at 10 o'clock. I am to meet him. He has no knowledge yet of the circumstances of Sir Charles's death, only that it was sudden. Holmes nodded. Bring him to me. I had hoped you would say that, Mortimer. Will you take the case? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He looked again at the fire, its glow casting soft light across the carpet, and then at the manuscript still wrapped on the table. Finally he said, This is not a case of ghosts or folklore, Dr. Mortimer, but I believe there is danger, real danger, on the moor, and yes, I will take it. He turned to Watson, who had been silent for some time, absorbing every detail. We begin tomorrow. The following morning dawned with a pale, anemic light that bled reluctantly through the fog hanging low over the roofs of London. It was the kind of morning that muffled footsteps and blurred outlines, lending the city an eerie softness. Even the horses pulling carriages along Baker Street seemed to tread more quietly, as if the weight of something unspoken still hung in the air. Holmes and Watson were ready early. Holmes, always exacting in his habits, wore his dark traveling coat and neatly tied cravat. His eyes, though calm, betrayed that alert glimmer Watson had come to associate with the first moments of a case, the spark of pattern recognition, of possibilities forming invisibly behind that expressionless. Watson, dressed more conservatively, had brought his notebook and pen, already aware he'd be expected to observe every word, every silence, and every look. They left 221B without delay and made their way through the mist to Waterloo Station. The platform was already alive with movement. The steam of engines mixed with morning fog, creating a curtain of white that pulsed and hissed as porters moved about with luggage, and newspapers rustled beneath the arms of businessmen. The smell of coal smoke, damp wool, and hot tea mingled in the air. Holmes stood still, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the crowd with the kind of attention that looked casual, but missed nothing. Watson spotted Dr. Mortimer first, tall and awkward among the stream of traffic. He stood at the far end of the platform, next to a shorter, sturdier man with a strong chin, bronzed complexion, and alert posture. Even from a distance, this man stood out, well-dressed but practical, confident but not careless. His eyes were bright, his stance firm. This was no pale aristocrat softened by years of idle inheritance. This was someone who had lived beyond England's borders. They approached. Mr. Holmes, Mortimer greeted them with relief. May I present Sir Henry Baskerville? Holmes extended a hand. Sir Henry, welcome to London. Sir Henry took the handshake firmly. Thank you, though I can't say the welcome's been warm. I've only been in your country 24 hours and already feel like I've stepped into something I don't quite understand. His accent was North American, clearly Canadian, with a rhythm slightly different from London speech, but precise and confident. Holmes gestured for them to step aside from the bustle of the platform, where they could speak more freely. They moved near a column as the train that had delivered Sir Henry hissed its final sigh. "You've had trouble already?" Holmes asked. Sir Henry pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat and passed it to him without a word. Holmes opened it carefully. Watson leaned in to see. It was a short note, the letters uneven, their source unmistakable, cut from a newspaper and pasted to the paper. Only one word was handwritten. "If you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." The word "moor" was written in ink, its curl oddly elegant compared to the crude collage of the rest. Holmes studied it closely. "Where did this come from?" "It was delivered to me at the hotel," Sir Henry replied. "The Northumberland. No name, no explanation, just waiting at the front desk when I checked in." Watson frowned. "And no one saw who left it?" "Apparently not. The staff said it had been slipped under the door of the porter's booth. I read it this morning over breakfast. You can imagine the impression it—" Holmes turned the paper blank. He examined the typeface on the clippings. "The Times." This was cut from yesterday's issue. "So whoever sent this had access to a recent paper and knew where you'd be." Sir Henry crossed his. "I'd say it's a poor attempt to scare me. But scare me away from what?" "The moor," Holmes said evenly. "Your inheritance. Baskerville Hall." Sir Henry glanced between them. "I was born in Canada. My father rarely spoke of I came here to take possession of the estate, only to find my uncle's death is surrounded by whispers and stories. And now this." He held up the— "Should I take seriously?" "Absolutely," Holmes replied, his voice calm but firm. "Whether the warning is meant as a genuine act of concern or a calculated threat, it must not be ignored. At the very least, someone has taken an interest in—" Sir Henry did not flee. If anything, he seemed quietly galvanized. "Well," he said, "whoever it is should know I don't frighten easily. I've come to claim my family's land, and I won't be scared off by a few glued letters." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Courage will be necessary, but so will caution." They made arrangements to reconvene shortly at the Northumberland Hotel. Holmes wished to inspect the Before departing the platform, Sir Henry reached down to paused and to Mortimer. "What is it?" Sir Henry looked puzzled. "I brought 2 pairs of boots, one new, one old, but one of the new ones is missing." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You're certain it was packed?" "I wore them briefly on the journey," Sir Henry said. "Took them off when I arrived, set them beside the bed, and this morning only one was there. I thought maybe it had been misplaced, but now—" He trailed off. Watson glanced at Holmes, whose expression had changed ever so. "First a note, now a missing boot," Watson said quietly. "This no longer seems like coincidence." Holmes didn't reply. He was already deep in the cutout letter, the message to stay away. A boot gone missing, not valuable, not papers. A single boot. Odd, yes, but deliberate. Too deliberate to be meaningless. They left the station together, the fog still hanging low. Holmes walked slightly ahead, silent, eyes distant, his mind already building invisible scaffolding around the facts. Watson followed beside Sir Henry, who, despite the warnings and the strangeness, walked with a steady stride, unaware that the ground beneath his inheritance was shifting. The Northumberland Hotel stood proudly among the tidy streets just west of Charing Cross, its red brick facade and etched glass doors lending it an air of quiet respectability. It was the sort of establishment frequented by traveling professionals, civil servants, and retired colonels passing time in the capital between club meetings and doctor's appointments. Not grand, but dependable. Holmes and Watson followed Sir Henry through the main entrance, where the scent of furniture polish and fresh bread wafted faintly. The carpet muffled their steps as they made their way to the second floor, where Sir Henry had been assigned a well-appointed suite with a view toward the Thames. Dr. Mortimer, lingering by the stairwell, had elected to give the three men space. Sir Henry unlocked the door and stepped inside, gesturing toward a small table near the bed. "There," he said, pointing. "That's where I left both of them." Watson looked down. A single brown boot, new and clearly expensive, stood at attention against the leg of the table. Its match was nowhere to be seen. Holmes said nothing. He walked past the boot without touching it and began to survey the room. His movements were slow and unhurried, each glance purposeful. He examined the edges of the rug, the brass handle of the window, even the faint depressions in the upholstery of the armchair. Then he turned back to the boot. "Tell me," he asked, "what was the make of the other pair?" Sir Henry frowned slightly, adjusting his waistcoat. "They were older, worn in, darker leather. I brought them mostly for walking. I hadn't unpacked them properly, just set the box under the dresser." Holmes moved to the dresser and knelt, reaching beneath it. The box was there, lid open, one boot inside. "The second boot is missing now, too," Holmes murmured. He stood, brushing a trace of dust from his sleeve. Watson blinked. "First a new boot disappears, then it returns, and now the old boot is missing?" Sir Henry looked puzzled. "So it seems. The porter said no one has been in the room except the maid, and nothing else is gone. Not money, not my watch, not my papers. Just boots." Holmes finally picked up the remaining new boot and turned it slowly in his hands, examining the sole, the lining, the heel. Then he set it down again, gently. "This," he said, "is not theft in any traditional... It's not vandalism either. It's collection." Sir Henry looked at him. "Collection? Someone has targeted your footwear specifically, but not both boots from a pair, just one. That tells me the objective isn't resale, nor is it meant to inconvenience. It's strategic and sensory." Watson looked up. "You think it's about scent?" Holmes nodded. "Exactly. A fresh boot carries little human scent. Factory varnish, perhaps, the brief contact of hands. But a worn boot, particularly one used for walking, absorbs the oils of the skin, the pressure of the foot, the shape and rhythm of the wearer's stride. It becomes an extension of identity." Sir Henry gave a short laugh, though it lacked humor. "You make it sound as if someone's trying to get to know me through my boots." "Not you," Holmes replied. "Your scent. Something is being prepared. I don't yet know what. But this is not random. Someone close is working with remarkable subtlety." He moved to the writing desk near the window, where a vase of carnations stood beside a set of stationery. Holmes removed an envelope and held it up to the light, checking its weight. Then he turned to Sir Henry. "This hotel has a quiet, orderly staff. No forced entry, no noise. That tells me your visitor either had a key or was let in." Sir Henry sat down, clearly unsettled, and the letter at the porter's desk, also subtle. "Indeed," Holmes said. "Someone with access, opportunity, and a keen interest in psychological manipulation. They're not trying to harm you, not yet. They're trying to shape your movements, to guide your steps." Watson stepped closer to the window. The mist was lifting slightly outside, revealing distant rooftops and chimneys lined in neat rows. "Holmes, you believe this is part of the same pattern that led to Sir Charles's death?" Holmes turned to face them. "I do. But we lack one vital piece: intent." He glanced at Sir Henry, his voice softening. "You were close to your uncle?" "I never met him," Sir Henry replied. "My father left England before I was born. The family ties were distant. Only recently had Sir Charles begun writing to me. He spoke of the estate, of restoring it. He wanted the family to return. His tone was eager, lonely maybe." Holmes nodded. "So, you were expected." Sir Henry looked down. "I suppose I was." There was a knock at the door. Dr. Mortimer stepped in quietly. "Pardon the intrusion," but the front desk just received a delivery for Sir Henry. A bellboy followed him, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table and left without a word. Sir Henry opened the wrapping slowly. Inside, nestled in crumpled tissue, was the missing new boot. Holmes stared at it, the laces, the heel polished. It had been taken, returned. Sir Henry let out a short breath. Now this one's back too. And the old boot gone in its place. Holmes stepped closer, then stopped. No note. No sign of who brought it, added Mortimer. No message, said Watson. Holmes's gaze lingered on the returned boot. Then, softly, he said, "This isn't a mistake." Later that same afternoon, the sky had cleared just enough for pale light to filter through the thinning fog, revealing the familiar chaos of London's late-day bustle. Carriages rumbled over uneven cobblestones. Newsboys called out the evening headlines with crackling voices. The hum of the city had resumed, but to Holmes it all faded into the background. He stood still on the corner across from the Northumberland Hotel, a modest distance from its front entrance. His coat collar was turned up, not because of the cold, but to reduce visibility. His eyes were sharp, fixed not on Sir Henry, but on the crowd around. From the moment Sir Henry and Mortimer stepped out for a short walk before dinner, Holmes had been watching, not them, but the man who had begun following them the moment they left the hotel steps. He had noticed him first from the second-story window of Watson's room, a tall figure, heavy-coated despite the mild air, with a broad-brimmed hat pulled low and a beard that did not sit quite right against his. The beard was too dark, too stiff, false. But it was the posture that confirmed it, the stillness when others moved, the way he kept to walls and corners, always maintaining distance, yet never falling too far behind. Watson had spotted him as well, after Holmes pointed him out, and now they stood together, not moving. "There," Watson said under his breath. "He's turning the corner after them." Holmes nodded. "And he's about to make a mistake." "What makes you so sure?" "Because he's not watching for me." Moments later, Holmes stepped off the curb with sudden precision, slipping into the flow of the street as if drawn by instinct. Watson followed, several paces behind. They crossed behind a passing omnibus and caught sight of the bearded man again, still shadowing Surrey and Dr. Mortimer as they entered Regent Street, and paused. Holmes didn't. He knew pursuit required patience. Too fast, and the subject flees. Too slow, and you lose. He timed his steps carefully, ducking behind a fishmonger's cart as the man glanced back. No alarm yet. The chase was quiet. They followed him through several turns, onto a quieter street near Cavendish Square, then down a narrower lane, flanked by hat shops and gentlemen's outfitters. At each intersection, Holmes and Watson kept their distance, closing in without announcing, and then opportunity. A hired cab, its driver standing beside it, had paused at the end of the lane, horse stamping, lantern swinging. Holmes quickened his pace. The bearded man turned a corner. Holmes turned too, now only steps behind. He quickened again, but just as he reached the cab stand, empty. No man. The bearded figure had vanished. Holmes's expression did not change, but his pace slowed. He stepped to the driver and spoke with a voice of quiet precision. "Did you just take on a fare?" The driver, a man with wind-chapped cheeks and a strong Irish accent, nodded toward the street. "Aye, sir. Gentleman in a dark coat, black beard. Got in not a moment ago. Told me to drive to Waterloo Station. Name he gave me..." The driver scratched his head. "Sherlock Holmes, it was." Watson's eyes widened. "He used your name?" Holmes turned slowly to... "He knows who I am, and he wants me to know that he knows." He stepped back from the cab and surveyed the surrounding buildings. Not one window moved. No figure emerged. Watson was unsettled. "A warning?" "More than that," Holmes said. "It's a message. He doesn't just know about Sir Henry. He knows I've joined the case, and he's not afraid to play games. They returned to Baker Street as the lamps flickered to life across the city. Holmes was silent for most of the journey. Watson could tell something new had entered Holmes's calculations, an adversary, not only capable, but precise. Back in their sitting room, the walking stick still rested on the table where Mortimer had left. The fire was low. Holmes walked to the window and looked out across the... "I've changed my mind," he said at last. Watson, removing his gloves, turned. "About what?" "I will not go to Devonshire. Not yet." Watson blinked. "But surely—" "No," Holmes interrupted. "If I go, they will vanish. Whoever this is, he watches closely. But you, they don't fear you." Watson was silent. "I need someone there, someone to observe what I cannot, to move freely, to ask questions that don't sound like interrogation. Someone whose loyalty I trust." The fire crackled softly. Holmes turned from the window and fixed his eyes on Watson, steady, calm, almost apologetic. "I need you to go to Baskerville Hall, John. You'll be my eyes, my ears, and perhaps more." Watson nodded once without hesitation. "Of course." Holmes smiled. "Then we begin our work properly." And somewhere in the shadowed lanes of London, the man with the false beard who claimed the name of Holmes vanished once more into the fog. It was late morning when the train pulled out of Paddington Station, its iron body trembling with power as it slipped through the grey outskirts of London and into the winding green ribbon of the English countryside. Inside the private compartment, Watson sat across from Sir Henry Baskerville and Dr. Mortimer, the three men each absorbed in their own. The rhythmic sound of the wheels against the rails filled the silence, steady, almost hypnotic, like a heartbeat guiding them toward something uncertain. Watson had left Baker Street early that morning after a brief and quietly serious farewell from Holmes. No dramatic parting, no last-minute instructions, a firm hand, a folded note to be read after arrival, and a single sentence: "Watch the people, the landscape people do." Now, as the train curved southward, Watson studied Sir Henry. The man was composed, though Watson could sense a slight tightness. There was a difference between courage and ignorance. Sir Henry possessed the former, but Watson wondered if he truly understood the weight of what waited for him in Devonshire. Dr. Mortimer, seated by the window, looked anxious. He had been fidgeting with his gloves for the past mile, staring out at the fields as if hoping the moor might appear early to prepare him. "This land," he suddenly, breaking the silence, "has a presence, you know. Not just hills and sky, but something beneath. Old." Sir Henry raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Watson leaned forward slightly. "You sound as if you believe the place itself is part of the danger?" Mortimer didn't look away from the... "It is." As they passed through villages and stone bridges, the skies grew heavier. Fields turned to forest, and eventually forest to... The green faded into muted browns and grays, broken only by the jagged shapes of distant tors, those bare granite outcroppings that rose like the bones of the earth itself. By the time they arrived at the small station near Grimpen, the wind had picked up. A carriage waited for them at the platform, drawn by two sturdy horses and driven by a solemn-looking man in a... He greeted them with a quiet nod and began loading their luggage without fanfare. As they set off toward Baskerville Hall, Watson watched the landscape unfold. The moor stretched in all directions, vast, quiet, indifferent. Low shrubs dotted the ground, and patches of peat glistened with moisture. In the distance, he saw what looked like ruined walls, perhaps the remains of ancient farms or forgotten stone circles. It was beautiful in a strange, stern way, and utterly removed from the world they'd left behind. The road curved uphill, and then at the crest, the house came into view. Baskerville Hall. It stood alone, framed by a border of yews and an iron gate, flanked by two stone pillars. The architecture was heavy, deliberate. Dark stone that had weathered centuries. It did not welcome. It endured. Watson felt it at once. the sense of the shadow of this was not just was a witness. The carriage passed through the gates and approached the wide front steps. As they came to a stop, the heavy oak doors opened, and an older man in a black suit stepped out, followed by a tall, pale woman in a modest gray dress. "Mr. Barrymore," said Mortimer, nodding, "and this must be Mrs. Barrymore." The butler bowed. "Welcome, Sir Henry, Dr. Watson, Dr. Mortimer. The house is ready for you." They were shown inside. The interior of Baskerville Hall was grand, but quiet, furnished with restraint, as though those who lived here had grown used to silence. The entrance hall rose 2 stories, with a carved staircase and tall portraits that seemed to follow them with their eye. Sir Henry looked around with interest, but even he could not hide a flicker of unease. Their rooms were prepared. Watson's was spacious but spare, thick drapes, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar and damp. The air was cool, and the fireplace had only just. That evening they dined in a long room with a single chandelier, casting light across the table. The Barrymores served the meal with quiet efficiency. Mr. Barrymore's expression remained unreadable throughout, and Mrs. Barrymore's eyes rarely met theirs. Watson, observant as always, noted the stiffness in their movements, not of formality, but of constraint. These were not servants at ease. Something pulled tight around. After dinner, Watson joined Sir Henry for a short walk around the estate. They moved slowly through the gravel paths near the yew alley, the lantern they carried flickering with each breeze. The moor stretched just beyond the property's edge, a presence in the dark, wide and endless. "I can't say I feel threatened," said quietly, "but there's something about this place, as if it's listening." Watson glanced at him. "You're not imagining that. There's a weight here, a kind that doesn't come from stone or soil." They walked in silence a little longer, then returned to the. Sir Henry retired early, and Watson returned to his room. He sat by the window for a while, writing the day's observations in his notebook. He noted the Barrymores' peculiar demeanor, the atmosphere of the house, the shape of the moor. Finally, he opened the envelope Holmes had given him. Inside was a single page with 6 words written in Holmes's neat, decisive hand. "Trust what they don't say aloud." Watson folded the paper slowly and stared out the window. Far in the distance, the moor rolled under the night sky, empty of stars, and somewhere out there, something waited. Night had fully settled over Baskerville Hall, pressing against the tall leaded windows and blanketing the moor in a silence so complete it felt like a physical thing, dense, unmoving, ancient. Inside the house, the flickering of the last fires brought more shadows than warmth. The air, though still, carried a peculiar heaviness, as if it had long since stopped circulating freely through the thick stone walls. Watson stood in the corridor just outside his chamber, candle in hand, and listened. It was just past 11. The house had gone quiet nearly an hour ago. Sir Henry had retired to his suite at the end of the eastern wing. Dr. Mortimer had left shortly after supper, returning to his own cottage further down the road, promising to check in again the next day. The Barrymores, having cleared the last of the dining plates with mechanical precision, had vanished behind the servants' doors like phantoms retreating into their routines, and yet something in the air was not still. Watson felt it, an expectancy, a quiet waiting that made the silence itself seem unnatural. It wasn't the sound of something approaching, but the absence of sound where sound should have been. No creak of boards, no wind against the windows, not even the muffled shifting of servants below. He moved slowly down the corridor, letting his candle cast faint golden halos on the wallpaper, now cracked in the corners and peeling slightly from age. The floor beneath him was carpeted, but uneven in places, as though the house itself had settled unevenly over the centuries. He paused at a tall window overlooking the western. Beyond it, The moor lay in motionless darkness, its hills and valleys lost in. Earlier that evening, Watson had taken his time exploring the lower levels of the house, making mental notes as Holmes had taught him. The drawing room was large but sparsely decorated. Thick drapes, velvet chairs, a grand piano that looked untouched. The library had been locked, a detail that struck him as odd, given that Sir Henry was now the rightful master of the house. He had intended to ask Barrymore for the key, but the butler had disappeared shortly after supper, with a brief apology about house matters to attend to. He had also noticed the portrait gallery, which stretched along the western wall of the main floor. The paintings were dark and brooding, rendered in the heavy oils of previous centuries. Men and women with hollow eyes, stern mouths, and heavy collars. They gazed down, not as ancestors, but as judges. The most recent portrait was of Sir Charles, his expression distant, his face tinged with melancholy. The man's death had left more than it had left the house. Returning now to the corridor, Watson passed a closed door on his left. It was locked and the brass knob turned without yield. He paused for a moment, frowning. Why lock rooms in a house with so few inhabitants? A faint noise caught his attention. It was subtle, so faint that he might have dismissed it under other circumstances. A brief rustling sound, like cloth brushing against stone. It came from somewhere above, perhaps the floor above it. He raised his candle and moved toward the staircase. As he ascended, he noted how cold the upper air was. The second floor had been warmed, the hearths dark and unused. The corridor was narrow, with low wooden beams and slanted ceilings. It was clearly the older part of the house. A faint draft moved through the hall, and with it came a smell he hadn't noticed before. Dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like iron dampened by time. He reached the end of the corridor and stopped before a door slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly. Inside was a small room, unused, cold. Furniture covered in white cloth. The windows here had not been cleaned in years. He stepped inside, and for a moment he could hear nothing but the beating of his own heart. Then, again, a faint sound from somewhere beyond. A whisper of movement. This time, not above, but below. Watson turned sharply. He retraced his steps, descending to the main level again, this time not toward the front of the house, but to the narrower hallway that ran past the servants' stairwell. Here the floor creaked despite the carpet, and the air felt even colder. A narrow window offered a view of the inner courtyard, still lifeless. He stopped at the door to the cellar stairs. It was closed. He hesitated. Then he slowly opened it. The smell of stone and coal dust rose up at once. He descended with care, one hand brushing the wall for balance, as the narrow staircase bent left into darkness. At the base, he paused and held the candle out in front of him. The cellar was vast, lined with brick and stone. The low ceiling and thick wooden beams made the space feel like a crypt. Old barrels rested against the walls, and a stack of firewood lay neatly in one corner. He moved slowly through the space, his footfalls muted by the thick air. The silence pressed in. Then a sound, not imaginary, not distant. A clear, soft click, the unmistakable sound of a latch closing. Watson spun around, holding his candle higher. Nothing, but he was not alone. He felt it now with absolute certainty. Not seen, not heard, but present. He stepped backwards, slowly, retreating toward whatever this was. It was not ready to be, and he was not foolish enough to corner it alone. He turned and climbed quickly, blowing out the candle before he reached the top and standing in darkness, listening once more. No chase, no sound, only silence. Watson emerged into the hallway and closed the door behind him carefully. He leaned against it for a moment, heart still beating heavily. He now understood what Holmes had meant. The silence was not peace. It was calculation. Back in his room, he sat at the desk and began to write his nightly report to Holmes. He described the house in full, from the shifting silence of the halls to the unused upper floor and the strange restlessness of the servants. He didn't mention the cellar, not yet. He wanted to observe further, draw them out. He ended the letter with one simple line. "There is something in this house, Holmes." Outside, the wind picked up slightly, the ivy against the stone walls, but the moor, endless and dark, remained still, as if it, too, the following night, as the wind whispered through the chimneys and the heavy velvet curtains, motionless frames. Dr. Watson lay fully awake. His candle had long since burned down to a stub, and the embers in the hearth glowed faintly, offering the only illumination in the room. He had tried to sleep. He had closed his eyes, adjusted his posture, even counted backward in a slow, deliberate rhythm, all to no effect. Something kept him awake. It wasn't fear, at least not fear in the usual sense. It was vigilance, that subtle tension in the chest that holds the body in readiness, even when the mind pleads for rest. It was the feeling of being near something hidden, but not silent, something just beyond the edge of understanding. He sat up quietly, pressing his feet to the cold floorboards. The wind outside had faded into stillness, which made the silence inside the house more acute. A silence that, once again, felt unnatural. And then it came, a sound, subtle but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, careful, deliberate, and not above, nor in the servant's wing, but here, in the corridor just outside his door. Watson reached for his dressing gown, tied it silently, and opened the drawer of his writing desk to retrieve the small revolver Holmes had urged him to carry. Not to use, Holmes had been clear about that, but to hold, to feel its weight, to remember that not all enemies are imagined. He eased the door open just enough to peer into the dim hallway. The candle sconces were dark. The only light came from the faint glow of at the far end of the corridor, where a faint, flickering amber hue spilled upward from the drawing-room fireplace below. The footsteps continued. They moved with intention, each one landing a thud upon the runner that stretched the length of the... Watson stepped fully into the corridor. He moved silently, hugging the wall, letting the shadows cover him as it led him past the guest rooms, past the unused library door, and toward a narrow window at the far end of the hall. Just beneath it, he saw it, a light, a candle flame held low, almost at waist level, moving slowly, just past the window. The figure holding it was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing. The face was turned away, partially obscured by the curtain, but Watson recognized the silhouette at once. Mr. Barrymore. The butler stood alone by the window, holding a candle in one hand and something pale in the other, a folded white cloth which he now raised toward the glass. Watson froze. Barrymore moved with precision, signaling with short rhythmic motions, side to side, then stillness, then again. He waited, then lowered the cloth and extinguished the flame. He stood there for several seconds in silence, watching. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the stairwell. Watson remained motionless. The air felt colder now, the stillness heavier. He had seen enough to know this was not superstition. It was not imagination. It was communication. He returned to his room only after the house fell still again. Sitting at his desk, he wrote quickly, detailing the events of the night with precision. He described Barrymore's actions, the candlelight, the signals, the way he had waited by the window. But what struck him most was not what Barrymore had done, but how he had done it. Calmly, confidently, without fear of being caught, as if he had done it many times before. And Watson could not shake the feeling that the window had not been the only one watching the moor that night. He ended his report to Holmes with a single question, underlined in black ink. Who is out there, Holmes, and what are they waiting for? He folded the letter, sealed it, and set it by the door for a morning delivery. As he returned to his bed, the room seemed colder than the shadows, longer, and though the house was silent once more, he had the distinct impression that somewhere, someone was waiting for a reply. The next morning dawned bleak and gray, the kind of morning where light arrived with brilliance, but with a heavy mist clung to the windows of Baskerville Hall, blurring the outline of the moor beyond like a landscape half remembered from a dream. The air inside the house was still, as though the building itself had not yet woken from the weight of night. Dr. Watson descended the main staircase just before 8. The hall below was empty, save for the lingering scent of damp stone and old wood. Somewhere in the distance a clock chimed the hour, its tone muffled. Watson had barely slept. The events of the previous night played and replayed in his mind. Barrymore's silent footsteps, the flickering candlelight, the strange signaling out toward the moor. He had not yet confronted the butler. He had learned enough from Holmes to know the timing, observation, questions, but that morning he would not be the only one in search of answers. Sir Henry was already seated at the breakfast, poking absently at a plate. His eyes were shadowed, not with fatigue, but with mounting frustration. He glanced up as Watson entered. "You didn't hear it last night, then?" he asked without preamble. Watson paused. "Hear what?" Sir Henry's mouth tightened. "A sound, a cry, out there." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "On the moor. It woke me. I went to the window, but I couldn't see anything." Watson sat down slowly. "What sort of cry?" "A man's voice," Sir Henry said quietly now. "A scream. Short. Not like a fox or a bird. Human." Watson's heartbeat quickened, though he kept his face composed. "You're sure it came from outside?" "Absolutely." It echoed. "Far off, but clear." He rubbed his forehead. "It's not the first time I've heard it, either." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Watson leaned in. "Sir Henry, I saw something last night, or rather someone. Mr. Barrymore. He was signaling from an upstairs window, using a candle and a white cloth. He was not aware I observed him." Sir Henry straightened. "To whom?" "I don't know, but the signal was deliberate, repeated. And afterward, he stood at the window for several minutes, just watching." Sir Henry's expression darkened. "Then let's find out what he's up to." That evening, just after 10 o'clock, Watson and Sir Henry positioned themselves in a dark corner of the corridor outside the window room. They extinguished their lamps and waited in silence, cloaked by the deep stillness of the house. The corridor stretched before them, dark and narrow, like a tunnel holding its breath. Minutes passed. Then, soft footsteps. Barrymore. The butler moved quietly, unaware he was being watched. He carried a candle once more, and a folded white cloth. He stepped to the same window, opened the curtains partway, and began the same slow, deliberate motion, side to side. Pause. Then again. Watson nodded to Sir Henry. They stepped forward together. "Mr. Barrymore," Watson said firmly. The man spun around. The candle shook in his hand, nearly spilling wet. His eyes were wide. "Doctor, sir, I didn't see you there." "No," said Sir Henry, stepping beside. "You didn't, but we saw you. And this is not the first time." Barrymore's face drew. I can't explain." "Then do," said his voice steady, but without cruelty. Barrymore hesitated, then slowly set the candle on the window ledge. His shoulders fell slightly. "I've been signaling my wife's brother." There was silence. "My brother-in-law, Selden, the escaped convict." Watson and Sir Henry exchanged a glance. "He's been living out there," Barrymore continued, his voice taut with guilt, "in the old stone huts near Blacktor. He's been hiding in the moor ever since he from Princetown prison. We've been bringing him food, clothes, trying to help him stay out of sight." Incredulous. Barrymore's "because he family. And he's not a bad man." "Not really. He got into trouble, yes, but it was drink and poverty and desperation. He was caught stealing, and the judge made an example of him. My wife begged me. She couldn't bear the thought of him dying out there." Watson was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, he asked, "Was it he who cried out last night?" Barrymore shook his head. "I don't think so. He's not foolish enough to draw attention. He stays in the shadows, only comes near the house when he sees our signal." Sir Henry stepped back. "And you didn't think to tell me this?" "It was not our place," Barrymore said. "Sir Charles, he never knew. We were only trying to keep it quiet until he could flee. He's been planning to leave for the coast. We've been helping him." Sir Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Watson looked toward the moor, barely visible through the window's dark glass. Somewhere out there a man lived among the stones, hunted, desperate, and perhaps not alone. "I want to see him," Sir Henry said, "with my own eyes. Tonight." Barrymore looked alarmed. "Sir, it's not safe," Watson intervened. "Then let me go. I'll find him, alone. He doesn't know me. If I can approach quietly, I may learn more than just what Barrymore." A few minutes later, Watson had armed himself and stepped out onto the rear grounds, the wind cutting across the grass like a whisper. The moor was a world of shifting shapes and shadows. The path, once distinct, dissolved into tufts of grass and slick stone. He moved slowly, eyes adjusting, boots finding careful purchase. The moon was thin behind the clouds, just enough light to guide him. He passed into the open field beyond the yew alley, past the last of the cultivated land, and into the wild. Then, far ahead, movement, a flicker, a shadow cresting a hill. A man hunched, bundled in rags. Watson knelt behind a rock, but then another figure, on a rise just up, almost motionless, tall, watching not the fugitive, but Watson. His blood chilled. This man did not move like one in hiding. He stood there, a silhouette cut from darkness itself, before slowly retreating behind the ridge. Gone. Watson waited, heart thudding, but the moor had returned to stillness. He turned back, retracing his steps. Selden was not the only one out there. Someone else watched the moor, and tonight, that someone had seen him. The morning air was cold and sharp, laced with a thin fog that softened the jagged outlines of the moor beyond Baskerville Hall. Dr. Watson stood on the front steps of the house, a letter to Holmes sealed in his coat pocket, and a sense of unease lodged deep in his chest. The events of the night before still lingered in his thoughts. Not only the strange, silent figure watching from the ridge, but the realization that the Barrymores were not the greatest secret keepers in the moorland darkness. Watson had written everything: Selden's presence, Barrymore's reluctant confession, the brief glimpse of a second man. But it wasn't just what he had seen, it was what he had. That Selden, though a fugitive, was not the real threat. That morning, as he watched the fog lift and the sky lighten into the dull gray of another Devonshire day, he resolved to begin exploring the neighboring. Holmes had left one very clear instruction: observe the people, listen to what they do not say. A short walk across a narrow trail led Watson to the edge of a low stone wall, broken in places and barely holding back the tangle of moor grasses that encroached on the road. Just beyond the wall, shrouded in an overgrown thicket of brambles and gnarled hedgerow, stood Merripit House. It did not look abandoned, though nature had certainly begun to reclaim it. Ivy clung to the eaves and spread across the shuttered windows. The roof slanted in places, and the garden had long surrendered its borders to wild growth. Yet smoke curled faintly from the crooked chimney, and near the front step stood a tall, wiry man wearing a straw hat and a net over one shoulder. Jack Stapleton. He looked up as Watson approached, his pale eyes lighting with quick curiosity. "Ah, you must be the gentleman from Baskerville," he said brightly, removing his hat and stepping forward with unexpected enthusiasm. "Dr. Watson, isn't it?" Watson nodded, surprised, but "I am. And you must be Mr. Stapleton." At your service, Stapleton. Forgive the appearance of the place. We keep it modest. Nature always seems to take a greater interest in our house. Watson allowed him. You live here alone? Stapleton shook his head and gestured toward the open door. No, I live with my sister. She's around here somewhere, no doubt wandering through the house like a ghost. He glanced back at Watson, something unreadable in his expression. Would you care for a short walk? I was just about to head out to the bog. There's a rare butterfly I've been trying to locate since the season began. You'll find the moor full of oddities, Dr. Watson. Many of them quite alive. Watson agreed, curious to observe the man in his... The two set off toward the mire, Stapleton walking with a spring in his step, clearly at ease in the wild. He spoke with fluency and speed, describing the moor's flora and fauna in loving detail, its insects, birds, even the particular coloring of its ferns. Yet Watson noticed something more. Stapleton's knowledge was not casual. It bordered on obsessive. He spoke of the Grimpen Mire with peculiar delight. It's a deceptive place, he said. Looks solid. But it'll take a full-grown horse within seconds. The peat looks firm in the light, but underneath it's waterlogged and treacherous. There are parts even I won't risk. They came to a slight rise that offered a view of the twisted terrain beyond, the mire stretching in slow undulations, riddled with reeds and clumps of trembling earth. I always think it's a perfect metaphor, Stapleton mused. Everything out here is a little dangerous if you don't know the signs. Just then, footsteps sounded lightly behind them. Watson turned. She stood several yards away, framed by the wind-bent trees and the moor behind her, tall, graceful, and clothed in a simple gray walking dress. Beryl Stapleton seemed, for a moment, out of place in the wild landscape, as though she had stepped from a painting and found herself stranded in something real. Her features were fine, and though she carried herself with restraint, her expression betrayed a flicker of something else, tension, perhaps, or fear. She approached slowly, and her eyes found Watson's with an intensity that unsettled him. Dr. Watson, Stapleton said, gesturing. My sister, Beryl. She nodded politely, and for a moment said nothing. Then, as if gathering courage, she turned to him. I must apologize, in a quiet voice. I mistook you for someone else. Watson tilted his. I don't believe we've met. She hesitated again, then took a single step closer. Please. Voice lower now, her eyes shifting toward her brother. If you are close to Sir Henry, convince him to leave. Tell him to go back to London. Today. Right away. Watson. Why? But already Stapleton was approaching, his face cheerful, his stride swift. Ah, Beryl, you're out earlier than usual. Dr. Watson was kind enough to accompany me. You didn't frighten him with one of your romantic warnings. His tone was light, but the words were carefully. Beryl's face changed almost imperceptibly. I was only offering concern. The moor isn't safe for those unfamiliar. Quite right, Stapleton said gently, but I'm sure Dr. Watson is more than capable of keeping to the safer paths. She looked away, then back at Watson, her eyes briefly meeting his. A warning still burned there, though no further words followed. Stapleton smiled. We should be getting back. It's not often we entertain visitors from the hall. They returned to Merripit House in silence. As they neared the gate, Stapleton turned once more to Watson. I do hope we'll see more of you. There's much to learn out here, and I have a feeling your presence may be enlightening. Watson gave a polite nod, but his mind was far from polite conversation. Back at Baskerville Hall, he sat in his room and opened his journal. He wrote not only what had happened, the shift in Beryl's eyes when her brother appeared, the quiet destiny in her voice, the sense that something vital had. He underlined a single line, sealing the report for Holmes. She is not his sister. Or the morning after his unsettling visit to Merripit House, Dr. Watson found himself once more drawn to the desolate paths of the moor. The air was dry and crisp, with a pale sun casting long shadows through the mist that clung stubbornly to the low ground. He walked not out of routine, but with purpose. There were questions too quiet to ask indoors, truths that whispered only out here, where the wind could not be bribed and the land told no lies. By mid-morning, he found himself again at the old wooden gate of the Stapleton property. The wild garden rustled softly with life. Tangled hedges, yellowing grasses, and the constant low hum of insects. Merripit House stood behind it, subdued and gray as ever, its windows shuttered on the upper floor, its stone facade mottled with lichen and age. Stapleton himself was outside, bending over a patch of flattened reeds near the edge of the garden. He looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps and waved. "Ah, Dr. Watson," he called cheerfully. "Come to join me in the hunt?" Watson approached with cautious politeness. "I wasn't aware you were chasing anything." Stapleton grinned. "Always chasing. That's the secret to life, isn't it?" He held up a small net and pointed to a specimen jar nearby. Inside was a pale green butterfly, its wings delicate, its body trembling slightly in the glass. A rare one, Coleus Hyle. Almost never seen this far west. It wandered too far from France, perhaps, or got lost, like so many do out here. Watson studied the creature without comment. The metaphor was not lost on him. "I've always been fascinated by things that don't belong," Watson continued, brushing a blade of grass from it. "They disrupt the pattern, draw attention, force questions. You'd be amazed at how nature punishes them." He looked up with a smile that was too measured to be careless. "You spend much time alone on the moor, Mr. Stapleton?" Watson asked casually. "Oh yes," he said. "It suits me. Most men fear the moor. They see only fog and danger. But to me, it's a map of hidden routes and ancient paths. I know its rhythm. I know where it will hold a man's weight and where it will take him without a sound." He said this with such casual confidence that Watson found himself measuring each word. Stapleton's gaze drifted toward the mire in the distance. "It's strange how places can mirror people, don't you think?" "Look at the Grimpen Mire. It seems quiet, still, but it shifts constantly beneath the surface. One wrong step and you vanish. I've seen it happen. A pony, 2 years ago, took 3 seconds." He didn't smile at the memory, but he didn't look disturbed either. Watson watched him for a long moment. "And you know it well, I gather." "Very well," Stapleton. "I've mapped most, but even I don't go." They stood in silence for the only sound the soft clicking of insects in the brush. Then Stapleton turned suddenly, as if struck by a new thought. "Tell me, how is Sir Henry finding the Hall? I imagine it's a strange transition, Canada to this desolate." "He's adjusting," Watson said, "though I suspect it's the people, not the landscape, that will determine whether he stays." "Ah," Stapleton said, nodding. "Well said. People do make the place, don't they?" He studied Watson a moment longer, then changed his tone. "And what of his intentions toward Beryl?" Watson blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Stapleton's voice remained light, but his eyes were sharp. "Sir Henry seems quite taken with her." "Naturally. She's an uncommon woman. But these things escalate quickly in lonely places. I've seen it before. City men tend to romanticize isolation. It's not always appropriate." Watson kept his voice level. "Has she expressed any concern to you?" Stapleton laughed, a little too loudly. No, not at all. I simply observe. It's in my nature. I care for her deeply. I look after her. We are a small family." He paused, then added, "I only hope Sir Henry understands boundaries." Watson let the silence hang. Stapleton adjusted his cuffs and gave a pleasant smile. "Well, I won't keep you. I expect you've got your own patrol of the moor today. There's always something to find if you look close." He turned back to his garden as Watson stepped away. But as he walked back along the winding path, Watson's mind was burning. There had been something too pointed in Stapleton, his comments about Beryl's ease in speaking of the deadly mire, his discomfort when intimacy or truth approached. And then it had been brief, controlled. But when the topic of Sir Henry and Beryl had emerged, there had been a moment, just a flicker, when the facade had cracked, the smile had frozen, the hands had clenched. His voice had dipped into something colder, tighter, more proprietary, not a brother's concern, something else entirely. Back at the hall, Watson entered the study and began to write. His letter to Holmes was longer than usual, its tone colder. He detailed Stapleton's words, his posture, the contradictions in his claims, and the unmissable flash of jealousy. He wrote until the sun sank behind the hill, and when he ended, it was with a single quiet line. "She is afraid of him, Holmes, and she has good reason to." The weather had shifted. The Devonshire sky, once thick with mist and soot-colored clouds, had begun to clear, just enough to allow thin streams of sunlight to filter through the manor's high windows. For the first time in days, the moor beyond Baskerville Hall was visible, not as a shadowy silhouette, but as a vast, rolling landscape of golden-brown grasses and dark green ridges. It did little to lift the tension that hung over the hall. In the quiet hours between tea and supper, Dr. Watson found himself again walking the length of the upper gallery. The footsteps of the Barrymores echoed faintly somewhere below. Sir Henry had excused himself, saying only that he wished to take a turn through the gardens alone. Watson let him go without question. He knew where the baronet's thoughts had been drifting, and soon Sir Henry confirmed it. That evening, as they sat before the parlor fire with 2 low tumblers of brandy in their hands, and the sound of the wind tapping lightly against the windows, Sir Henry leaned forward. "She's unlike anyone I've met," he said, eyes reflecting the amber of the hearth. "I've known women with beauty, others with spirit, but she has something else, a kind of sorrow behind the eyes. It draws you in without ever asking." Watson gave a thoughtful, "Have you spoken with her since the morning at Merripit House?" Sir Henry hesitated, then reached into his inner coat pocket and produced a folded sheet of cream-colored stationery. "She wrote to me," he said almost cautiously, "left it with one of the servants who walks down toward the village." Watson took the note, not to read, but to observe. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and softly slanted. The paper bore the faint scent of lavender, subtle, refined, and somehow distant. When Sir Henry unfolded it, he read aloud, "I trust you are well. Forgive the manner of this note. I cannot say all I wish, nor do I know how to say what little I can. Your presence here is complicated. I hope you will believe me when I say your kindness is not unreturned. But there are forces near you that do not welcome your warmth. Please be cautious. We live in delicate shadows, and they are easily." It was unsigned. Watson remained still weighing each word. He could hear the voice of Beryl Stapleton in them, guarded, hesitant, but deeply human, a voice wrapped in fear and longing. Sir Henry sat back. "You see? She wants to say more, but something stopped." Watson nodded slowly. "I believe you're right." Yes, but he was thinking of more than romance. He was thinking of warnings, of misdirection, of the kind of captivity that wears no chains, silences nonetheless. Whatever Beryl's circumstances truly were, she was not free to speak them aloud. Later that evening, Watson retreated to the study where the fire had nearly gone out, and the shadows had begun to pool in the corners of the room. There he opened his travel case and unfolded the correspondence he had been keeping for Holmes. The latest report was longer than most. In it, Watson detailed the exchange between Sir Henry and Beryl, the tone of the letter, the caution in her language, and the lack of a signature. He recorded Stapleton's jealous outburst from the day before and the careful tension that seemed to hang over Merripit House like a fog. What disturbed Watson most wasn't just Beryl's cryptic warning. It was how carefully it had been delivered. There was no plea for rescue, no declaration of fear, just a quiet urgency masked as politeness, the kind of message that could only be written under scrutiny. He paused at the end of the letter, pen poised, then added, "He is under surveillance, perhaps worse." He sealed the note on the hallway text morning's rider and stood in the silence of the room for a long moment, watching the last flicker of flame. Upstairs, Sir Henry was pacing again, not with fear, but with hope. And Watson knew well, sometimes hope was the most dangerous condition of all. It began, as many things do in the moorlands, with silence. The night had wrapped itself tightly around Baskerville Hall, cloaking the old house in shadows and damp, muffled stillness. The wind had stilled. Even the occasional owl, whose echoing call had become familiar over the past weeks, had gone quiet. Dr. Watson lay in bed, not asleep, but not quite awake, his thoughts drifting uneasily across everything he had seen. Barrymore's secret signals, Selden's gaunt silhouette on the moor, Beryl's haunting warnings, and Stapleton's eyes, sharp, cold, watching everything. Each moment, each detail floated like pieces of glass, suspended in the air, sharp-edged and unfinished. Then came the sound. It cut through the night like a knife. One singular cry, high, terrified, human. It echoed across the hills and through the window panes, and Watson was out of bed before it had even faded. He threw on his coat, boots unlaced, heart pounding, not from fear but from a sudden, burning clarity. Someone was out there, and they were dying. He reached the corridor just as Sir Henry burst from his own room, half-dressed, eyes wide. "You heard it?" Watson nodded. "Come, we don't wait." They moved quickly, down the stairs, out the back door, and into the breathless dark. The moor met them like a wall. Even with lanterns in hand, the fog refused to part completely. It pressed in around them, thick and shivering, and the light barely pushed more than a few feet forward. But still, they moved, driven not by direction, but by instinct. The cry had come from the west, toward the cliffs above the Grimpen Mire. They passed the yew alley, the broken fence near the withered trees, and the old gate whose iron hinges whined in the wind. Then the land, and they followed the dip of the path as it curved toward. Somewhere above, a star appeared, flickering as though uncertain whether it should shine. Then another sound, low, something. They quickened their pace. The ground turned rocky, rising steeply. They scrambled up a slope of loose stones and flattened scrub until they crested the top. And there, barely visible in the lantern glow, lay a motionless shape at the edge of a jagged precipice. Sir Henry rushed forward. "God above!" Watson was already kneeling beside. The man's clothes were ragged, his boots scuffed and torn. He had landed hard, face downward, one arm twisted beneath him, his back contorted unnaturally. At first glance, he might have simply fallen and broken his... But the mouth, it was twisted open in a final gasp, and the eyes, they stared out in frozen, unimaginable horror. Watson felt his pulse slow. No blood, no wounds, just terror. Sir Henry took a step closer, then paused. "My clothes," he whispered. Watson turned sharply. He was right. The man wore a familiar jacket, a coat Watson had seen in Sir Henry's trunk, a pair of trousers, old but unmistakably his, even the boots. He had dressed like Sir Henry. A noise behind them made them turn. It was Barrymore, breathless, coat flapping behind him, face pale in the lantern light. "I heard it too," he gasped. Then, seeing the body, he stopped. Watson stood. "You recognize him?" Barrymore swallowed hard. "Selden." The word fell with a weight that seemed to settle over the entire ridge. "My wife gave him the old clothes," Barrymore explained hoarsely. "He thought he'd blend in, escape across the moor. They wouldn't look for a baronet's coat on a convict." Watson stared again at the body. He had been hunted, mistaken, Dead. Returned. Then a thought struck Watson like a blow. If he was mistaken for Sir Henry, slowly turning toward the baronet, then whatever or whoever killed him was not acting randomly. Sir Henry didn't speak, but his hands clenched. Watson felt his own breath catch. The legend had not killed Selden. A real creature had, one that tracked by scent, by clothing, and some human hand, had trained it to do so. The morning after Selden's body was found, the sky over Dartmoor remained the same lifeless gray it had worn for weeks. Clouds hung low, unmoving, as though weighed down by the burden of... At Baskerville Hall, the corridors felt emptier than before. Even Sir Henry, usually determined to shrug off the darkness of the moor, remained uncharacteristically. Dr. Watson's... The image of Selden's twisted form at the cliff's edge replayed in his mind, not because of the man's death, but because of the implications behind it, that he had died wearing Sir Henry's clothes, and that something had killed him, not by claw or gunshot, but through the sheer violence of fear. A calculated fear, targeted, and most of all Watson. Holmes had gone silent. No reply to his letters, no coded telegram, no unexpected visitor arriving at the door with dry wit and distant eye. Watson had begun to wonder if he truly was on his own in that afternoon. In a strange surge of restless determination, he decided to venture back out across the moor, not toward Merripit House, not toward Grimpen Mire, but to the northeast, toward a section of the moor he had seen only from a distance, a region broken by jagged rocks, thin scrubs, and the ruins of stone huts left behind by shepherds or wanderers, long forgotten. He walked alone, following no trail, but instinct. The wind shifted as he climbed a low rise. Then he saw it. At the base of a ridge, nearly hidden behind a curtain of brambles and slate, sat a crude stone shelter, partially collapsed, but with a roof still intact. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Watson crouched. He approached quietly, his boots making little sound against them. As he reached the edge of the stones, he pressed himself to the wall and listened. Nothing. Then slowly, he stepped around the doorway, revolver in hand, and froze. Inside, standing calmly, pipe in mouth, over a rough table covered in maps and notes, was Sherlock Holmes. The detective looked up, completely unsurprised. "Ah, I was wondering when you'd arrive." Watson stared for several seconds before words came. "You're here." "I am. You've been here." Holmes tapped the end of his pipe. "Indeed, for some days now." Watson stepped inside, his voice low but firm. "I thought you were in London. I've written to you, sent reports. Which I received," Holmes said, lifting a bundle of carefully folded letters. "Your observations were thorough, quite useful." Watson felt anger. "You were watching me, not watching everyone. The less they suspected I was here, the more freely they moved. Had I remained at Baskerville Hall, our adversary would have stayed in the shadow. Me gone." Holmes gestured slightly. He believed he was on. Watson exhaled. "The pieces began to connect. The figure I saw on the moor was me or Selden. You weren't the only one out walking it. And the bearded man in London?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That, I'm afraid, was Barrymore, attempting, in his own clumsy way, to shield Selden. He posed as me to throw off pursuit. Admirable, though poorly executed." Watson leaned against the stone wall. "You knew about Selden?" "I suspected. I needed confirmation. Your reports confirmed the Barrymore's involvement, and your account of Stapleton—" Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing. "Has been invaluable." Watson nodded slowly. "The sting. You could have told." Holmes's gaze softened. "I trust you, implicitly, which is precisely why I let you work open. Your honesty draws people. They believe in your decency. That makes them speak freely around you, and sometimes that's more powerful than deduction." They stood in silence. Outside, the wind rustled the dry grasses along the ridge. Holmes turned back to the table. I know who our enemy is. Watson stepped closer. Then, tell me. Holmes pointed to a section of the map where Merripit House was marked in red pencil. Jack Stapleton is not who he claims. His real name is Roger Baskerville, Jr., the son of Sir Charles's brother, long believed dead in South America. He has hidden in plain sight, cultivating a false identity and carefully positioning himself as an innocuous naturalist. Watson's breath caught. He's a Baskerville. The only other heir after Sir Henry? That is the motive. Remove Sir Charles, then Sir Henry, and the estate returns to him. He's played a long game, using fear as his weapon and the legend of the Hound as his disguise. But Selden was a mistake, or rather a failed test. The Hound was meant for Sir Henry. It followed the scent on the clothes. Selden died by proximity. Watson stepped back. So, there is a Hound. Oh yes, very real, but not supernatural. We'll find it soon enough. And when we do, we'll have all the proof we need. Holmes packed his notes into a leather folio and slung a wool coat over his shoulders. Tonight, he said quietly, we let the trap begin to close. Watson looked out into the deepening dusk. The shadows stretched long across them. The wind had picked up again. The game was no longer hidden. It had only just begun. The sky over Dartmoor was thick with clouds again, the kind that seemed to press down on the land with a silent, heavy certainty. The moor breathed slowly, its ancient stones and swaying grasses holding their secrets just a little longer. But for Sherlock Holmes, the time for silence, the case, long shaped by shadows and suggestion, was now moving into the realm of the Back inside the weathered shelter he'd made his headquarters, Holmes spread out his materials, a hand-drawn map of the moor, a series of notes written in his precise script, and a collection of clippings from local newspapers. Beside them, pinned carefully under a stone, was a photograph, faded, creased, and black and white. It showed a young man no older than 20, standing with a woman outside a colonial-style building under a harsh sun. The young man's hair was thinner, his face softer, but unmistakably it was Jack Stapleton, or rather, Roger Baskerville, Jr. Holmes had obtained the photograph from a private investigator in South America who had long followed rumors of the disgraced branch of the Baskerville. The youngest son of Sir Charles's brother had fled England in disgrace decades ago, following a scandal involving theft and debt. The family had quietly buried his name, believing him dead in the heat and disease of the tropics. But he had not died. He had returned under a new name, a new identity. Holmes walked Watson through it all, speaking with deliberate calm, every word. Roger Baskerville, Jr. arrived in Devonshire under the name Jack Stapleton some years ago. He posed as a naturalist, drawing little attention. He purchased Merripit House for a fraction of its worth, citing a need to be near the Grimpen Mire for his studies. But it wasn't insects that interested. Watson listened, arms full. It was the Hall, Holmes nodded, and the inheritance. Once Sir Charles died, only Sir Henry stood between him and full claim to the estate. He used the legend, Watson said, finishing. Holmes's voice lowered. He kept it alive, fanned it. He made it more than just a local myth. It became a tool, one designed to terrify, to disorient, and ultimately to kill. Holmes opened a small leather journal. He trained a hound, a powerful mastiff, and conditioned it to track Sir Henry's scent. He painted the animal with phosphorus, making it glow in the dark. That's why the stolen boots were specific. The scent had to be personal, natural, not leather, not new, old, worn, familiar. He turned a page. The attacks didn't rely on brute force. They relied on the mind, fear, shock. When Sir Charles died, it wasn't from a bite. It was from his heart, overwhelmed by the horror of what he believed he saw. Watson sat down slowly, absorbing it. And Beryl? Then spoke with, not his sister, his wife? kept close to add a layer of respectability. People assume purity in a household with a lady present, but I believe she's as much a victim as anyone in this affair. Her warnings to Sir Henry, her fear, they speak volumes. Watson recalled her eyes, dark, clouded with something like dread, and nodded silently. Holmes continued, "We've seen this before, Watson. A mind as sharp as his, driven by desperation and legacy. It becomes its own poison." He folded the photograph and slid it in. "Stapleton is bold, but careful, methodical, and now dangerously close to succeeding. But he's made a mistake. Several. What will we do?" Watson asked. Holmes stood and walked to the doorway, looking out across the wide sweep of the moor. "We let him believe he's won. Sir Henry must attend dinner at Merripit House tomorrow night as planned. He will walk home across the moor alone." Watson's eyes narrowed. "It's a trap." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, but this time the trap is ours." He turned, gathering his coat. "We'll be there, in the fog, armed, watching, and when the hound comes, as it must, we'll put an end to both myth and murderer." Watson nodded slowly. There was something final in Holmes's voice, an end drawing near. The moor outside remained still, unaware of what would unfold upon it tomorrow night. But within the quiet, a reckoning was forming. The man who had dressed as a scientist, who spoke of butterflies and bore the name of a stranger, was not simply chasing inheritance. He was chasing a throne of fear, and Holmes intended to tear it down, brick by brick, lie by lie. As the sun sank behind the moor a strange silence settled over the land. It wasn't the natural hush but something denser, like a breath held too long. Even the wind, so often a constant in the vast loneliness of Dartmoor, seemed to avoid Merripit, as if unwilling to disturb. From the edge of the low ridge where Holmes and Watson crouched behind a cluster of rock, the Stapleton property appeared deceptive. Its slate roof, broken chimneys, and warped window frames gave it the look of a house clinging to the edge of ruin. Wild grasses clawed at the walls. Thorny bushes, untended for years, crept up around the place did not belong to the world of the living. It had the look of a place forgotten, or worse, intentionally hidden. But tonight it was at the center of everything. The plan had been laid with precision. Sir Henry, ever brave, perhaps too brave, had agreed to act as bait. He would dine with Stapleton, pretend to trust, pretend to believe. Then, after the meal, he would take the footpath back across the moor, just as Sir Charles had done weeks before. Holmes and Watson would be waiting in the dark, stationed along the route, their guns ready, their nerves taut as string. But first, they had business at the barn. They approached it just before dusk, keeping low through the thick brush and broken fencing behind the property. The barn was set back from its roof sagging in the middle, its wood blackened by years of rain and wind. At a glance it looked abandoned, but Holmes had observed the faintest glimmer from its narrow slats the night before, just enough to see a lantern burning where none should be. Tonight they would see what lived behind that door. Holmes reached it first, crouching beside the heavy iron latch. He waited, listened, then gestured to Watson to cover him. In one swift motion, he lifted the latch and pulled the door wide. The smell hit them instantly. Rotting meat, damp straw, something deeper, animal, musky, pungent. It was the unmistakable scent of predator. Inside the barn, the shadows writhed with movement. In the far corner, chained to a heavy iron stake, buried in the dirt floor, stood a massive creature, a black mastiff. No, a thing shaped like a mat, but larger, thicker across the shoulders, bred for strength, not grace. Its ribs heaved with slow, steady breaths. Its eyes, once likely brown or yellow, seemed unnatural now, reflecting back the lantern light in an eerie greenish glow. Its fur, already dark, had been painted. phosphorus. Watson's stomach turned as he realized the purpose. Even in the dim light of the barn, the animal's coat shimmered faintly. In the night fog, it would burn. It would glow like a demon. And the villagers, already primed by years of legend and fear, would believe they had seen the hound of hell. It was no demon. It was flesh. It was real. And it was starving. At the sight of them, the hound snarled low and deep. Its body coiled as if ready to lunge, though the chain held foam collected at the corners of it. Around the stake lay bones. Some animal, a bucket of meat, stood nearby, the contents long gone. The hound had been kept lean, angry. Watson stepped back, his voice barely above a whisper. It's trained to kill. Holmes gave a single nut. On scent, on command, with fear. They didn't stay long. The last thing they wanted was to agitate it or risk a sound reaching the... But as they turned to leave, Holmes stopped. He reached into his coat and pulled out one of Sir Henry's missing boots, retrieved, he said, earlier from the manor when no one was looking. He placed it inside a small wooden box just outside the barn, where the scent would be strong but unreachable. We let it smell him again, enough to fix the target in its mind. If Stapleton unleashes it tonight, they slipped away through the grass and took their positions on the moor, the evening stretching long and silent before them. Far in the distance, Merripit House began to glow with weak lamplight. Inside, Sir Henry dined beside a man who would see him dead by midnight, and outside, chained in darkness, the hound waited. It did not know why it had been painted, nor why its hunger had been sharpened like a blade. It only knew that tonight it would be released, and it would follow a scent. The moor at night had always possessed a kind of presence, an ancient patience that crept into the bones, into the air, into the very stillness between breaths. But on this particular night, that presence shifted. It wasn't just the usual cold or the sprawling quiet. It was something heavier, something waiting. Holmes felt it first, not as a hunch, he distrusted hunches, but as a convergence of facts. All the elements had been placed, the letters, the footprints, the boots, the beast, the fear. Everything Jack Stapleton had built now teetered on the edge of revelation. They stood in the dark, crouched behind a dense outcropping of gorse, their lanterns extinguished, breath controlled, coats drawn tight. Watson checked his revolver again, not out of doubt, but habit. Beside him, Holmes was still, completely still, as though he had merged with the landscape itself. Sir Henry was expected to leave Merripit House at 9. His path would take him alone through a half-mile stretch of open moor. No trees, no cover, just scrub and stone under a low sky that promised fog. A cruel choice of ground. Holmes suspected it had been selected by Stapleton for precisely that reason. They had rehearsed it earlier, carefully, without words. Sir Henry would walk the path at his usual pace, unarmed, as though he suspected nothing. He had insisted on this role, his eyes resolute, his mouth set with the quiet steel of someone who had grown tired of being hunted. If he was to be the bait, then let the trap close with him at its center. Holmes had objected, of course, repeatedly, but Sir Henry's argument had been simple and true. If I stay away, he wins. If I run, he runs next. So now the night waited. A low fog began to creep across the moor, rolling in over the grass like the edge of a slow wave. It wasn't thick, not yet, but it softened shapes, blurred distances, swallowed sound, a perfect veil. Holmes murmured, "Listen, not with your ears, with your whole body." Watson didn't answer. He understood. From where they lay, the path unwound like a dark ribbon, cutting east across the moor and dipping between two ridges before climbing back toward the direction of Baskerville Hall. It was narrow, often muddy, flanked by tall reeds and jagged outcrop. There would be nowhere to hide for Sir Henry. That was the point. At precisely 9:12, A soft glow appeared on the distant trail. A lantern, carried low, moving slowly. Sir Henry. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, not hurried. A man simply returning home after dinner. He had no idea, at least in appearance, that a killer waited for him hidden in the landscape. Holmes tightened his grip on the revolver at his side. His eyes did not blink. The light continued forward. Watson counted the seconds in his mind, each one a drop of water in a deepening pool. And then a sound, distant, low, like a rumble, then closer, a howl. Not the high-pitched cry of a wolf or the quick bark of a hunting dog, but something else, something raw, something that felt old. It cut across the moor like a... Sir Henry stopped. His lantern dipped. He turned slightly as if trying to locate the sound. Holmes stood slowly, motioning to Watson. No movement. Wait. The fog parted slightly on the far ridge. A shape emerged. It was not fast. It moved with the confidence of something that knew it would not need to chase for long. Shoulders like a bear, low to the ground, black as pitch, except where it glowed. A dull, sickly luminescence clung to its fur. Not bright, not obvious, but enough to make it shimmer. Otherworldly, beneath the moonless sky. Sir Henry began to back away, dropping the lantern. The hound growled. Holmes whispered, "Now." They stepped out from behind the rocks, weapons raised, boots silent on the damp ground. But they didn't fire. Not yet. They let it come closer. The hound broke into a run. It moved like a storm, fast, heavy, unstoppable. Sir Henry turned and began to run, stumbling slightly over uneven ground. The hound opened its mouth wide. Its teeth caught the light, long, yellowed, gleaming. Holmes shouted, "Now, Watson!" 2 shots rang out, crackling across the moor like thunder. The beast staggered, but didn't fall. Holmes fired twice more. Watson followed. The hound let out a roar, something close to a scream, and collapsed onto the path, skidding across the mud. It slid almost to Sir Henry's boots before going still. Silence, no breathing, no twitching, just stillness. Watson ran to Sir Henry, who stood frozen, trembling, eyes locked on the creature at his feet. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Easy," Watson said, steadying him. "It's over." Holmes crouched, examining its painted poorly. The phosphorus hasn't dried in places. He rushed it, greedy. Watson looked down at the... It was enormous, at least 120 pounds, with muscle corded under its thick black... There was no question. This was the devil hound, but it was no demon, no ghost, just bone, blood, and breath, once unleashed by human hands. Sir Henry dropped to one knee, still, his voice finally hoarse, and it would have killed me, Holmes said, and it has already. The fog continued to drift across. Only this time was earned. The fog had not. Instead, it deepened, curling in ghostly coils over the moor, the breath of something ancient. It rolled through the grasses and over the rocks, blurring outlines, swallowing distance, muting every sound until even a heartbeat felt intrusive. The hound's body still lay on the path, immense, grotesque in its silence. The phosphorus clinging to its fur gave off a faint, sickly luminescence, pulsing dimly with each breeze that swept through the night. It looked dead, and it was, but its presence lingered, as though the beast's legend had not quite accepted its end. Holmes rose slowly from where he had examined the body. There was no satisfaction on his face, only focus, edged with something colder than anger. "Sir Henry," he said, turning to the baronet, "do you require a physician?" Sir Henry stood near the path, hunched slightly, his coat damp with... His face, usually full of life and sharp good humor, was pale, nearly gray. His eyes had... He looked not wounded, but hollowed out, carved open by something more precise than tooth or claw. No, it didn't touch me. He took a slow, deliberate breath, but his legs buckled slightly. Watson was already at his side. "Sit. Let it pass. You were nearly killed." Sir Henry obeyed, sinking onto a nearby boulder, trembling beneath his coat. "I saw its eyes. God, I saw them. It was real." Watson nodded, keeping his tone calm. "Yes, but no longer." Holmes turned his gaze back to the corpse. A mastiff, crossbred, likely raised for size over speed, conditioned through deprivation and pain. This was no pet gone mad. It was created for this purpose, engineered. It hunted by scent and fear. And tonight, it was meant to finish what it began with Sir Charles. He took a handkerchief from his coat and wiped the revolver before holstering. "You understand now, Watson, why the boot theft was never mere eccentricity. It was necessary. The hound couldn't hunt out a scent." Watson said nothing. The pieces had long since aligned in his mind, but it was something else entirely to see it realized, to watch myth bleed into reality, and then lie lifeless at your feet. Holmes examined the creature's mouth. The teeth have been filed, sharpened, and the lips burned by the chemicals. The phosphorus application was careless tonight. There's still moisture clinging to the fur. Stapleton was in a hurry. Watson frowned. He must have sensed we were closing in. Likely. Or he simply grew impatient. His plan had already been delayed once when we refused to send Sir Henry to the hall alone. He would not let this window pass again. Sir Henry looked up suddenly. "He invited me to dinner tonight, as if nothing were wrong." Holmes nodded. "Of course, that was the performance. He needed your trust intact, so you would walk home alone, just as Sir Charles." The silence pressed down again. Then Watson asked, "You said the hound already killed once. You're certain now?" Holmes looked out into the dark. There was no other explanation. Sir Charles's heart did not fail from illness. It failed from terror, from expectation. He saw something he believed impossible, and in that moment, his belief killed him. Watson was quiet for a long while. Then, "Fear as a weapon." "Yes," Holmes said, "the most effective kind, because the mind finishes the work the enemy begins." Holmes knelt beside the hound and gently lifted its massive paw. No prints visible now in the soft ground, but the prints that were found near Sir Charles's body, they matched this spread. Our beast is accounted for. The question now, where is its master? Watson stiffened. "Stapleton will know by now. When the hound didn't return, he'd realize it failed. And he'll run," Holmes said, glancing. "It's what cornered men do." He turned to Sir Henry. "You'll go back to Baskerville Hall. Watson will accompany you. You'll stay inside, lock the doors, and touch nothing until I return." Sir Henry hesitated. "And you?" Holmes's voice was quiet. "I'm going to Merripit House." Sir Henry looked at him, still pale, but now with a flicker of that familiar boldness. "You'll confront him. I will collect proof." Watson stepped forward. "Not alone. You're outnumbered, exposed. Let me—" But Holmes lifted a hand, not unkindly. "You've done your part. Tonight you kept Sir Henry alive. That is no small thing." He looked once more to the hound. "The myth is broken. But myths do not vanish on their own. Someone makes them, feeds them, paints them with phosphorus, and sets them loose." Holmes turned into the fog and disappeared. The fog was thicker now, not only dense but strangely alive, folding in layers across the moor with the slow weight of sleep. Holmes moved through it silently, his coat clinging to his legs, his footsteps swallowed by the wet grass. No lantern, no sound. He relied on memory, instinct, and the faint outlines of the land he had studied for days. The hound was gone, but the mind behind it remained, and that mind, he knew, would not sleep tonight. The path to Merripit House was a narrow, treacherous line between open fields and the dangerous expanse of Grimpen Mire. Holmes stayed clear of the mire's edge. He had seen enough of it to understand how easily one wrong step and the bog would pull you down silently, never returning what it claimed. It had been Stapleton's favorite subject in conversation, a naturalist's curiosity, but Holmes now saw it for what it was, strategic. He reached the outer edge of the property just before midnight. Merripit stood dark, except for a single flickering light in the not enough to illuminate anything significant, just enough to suggest someone still awake, watching. Holmes did not approach the front door. Instead, he circled the house wide, staying low until he reached the dilapidated barn where the hound had once been kept. Its door now hung ajar, swinging faintly in the wind, revealing a dark emptiness within. The smell remained, metal, fur, and death. But the beast itself, what mattered now, was the evidence. Inside, Holmes lit a small covered lantern and moved carefully. Along the far wall were two overturned crates, one of which still contained a scrap of gauze soaked in phosphorus. A dull glow clung to its edges, barely visible. Next to it were tins of the same chemical, their lids stained and fingers of the substance crusted along the rims. And there, beneath a pile of discarded sacks, he found it. A journal, bound in cheap leather and worn at the corners. It contained pages of tightly written notes in Stapleton's hand. Most appeared to be research on rare insects and local botany, probably real or real enough to pass casual scrutiny. But tucked in the back were several loose sheets, coded and unsigned. Holmes flipped through them swiftly, recognizing the marks, times, locations, behavioral notes on Sir Charles, weather patterns, the moon cycles, notations of test runs with Subject A. One sheet included a sketch of the moor, with Baskerville Hall, Merripit House, and several paths marked in red pencil. Among them, the return path from dinner. It was all here. He pocketed the journal, then turned his lantern toward the house. The rear entrance was unlocked. Holmes had expected this. A man who believes he is untouchable becomes careless, and a man planning flight often makes his last mistake too early. Inside, the house was a hushed ruin. The floors creaked with every step. The furniture, what little there was, had been covered in sheets that had yellowed with time. Dust clung to the corners. Holmes moved through the hallway, careful not to disturb the cobwebs in the corners. Every detail here had served as camouflage, a house of modest poverty to distract from the methodical cruelty within. He entered the study. The light he had seen from the moor burned weakly on the desk, a lantern, nearly out of oil. Papers had been gathered in haste, some left behind on the floor. A suitcase sat near the door, half-packed. There was no sign of Stapleton. Holmes checked the desk drawers. Inside one, he found a second map, larger, more detailed. The routes of the moor were drawn with painstaking care, with specific trails into Grimpen Mire, traced out in ink. Beside them, written in small, careful letters, were reminders. Keep to the stones. Avoid the west. Sinkholes shifting. Safe crossing before rainfall only. He was planning to disappear, not to hide, to vanish. Holmes moved to the window. From here, he could just see the far edge of the property where the grass turned darker, where the mire began. There were no footprints, not yet, but the ground was soft. If Stapleton had fled that way, he would have left. Brief, perhaps, but enough. Holmes stepped back into the night, keeping his lantern low, eyes trained to the ground, and there they were. Footprints, booted, rushed, uneven, not walking but fleeing. They led directly toward the mire. Holmes followed. The fog here was thicker still, curling around his knees, the air damp and cold against his. The footprints continued, then doubled back, then turned again. Panic. The path was no longer sure. The careful notes had been abandoned. This was instinct now, desperation. Then, suddenly, the prince stopped. Not faded, stopped. Ahead, only the wet black gleam of the mire stretched before him, quiet and still. Holmes stood at the edge, waited, listened, nothing. He stepped forward carefully, testing each step, but the soft ground gave warning. One more pace, and he would risk following the man into the deep. He did not need to. Roger Baskerville, Jr., known to the world as Jack Stapleton, had vanished into the land he believed he controlled, swallowed by the bog. No cries, no sign of struggle, just absence of fitting. The mire had claimed its own architect. Holmes turned back toward the house, the lantern's glow warming his hand, though justice, when delivered by nature, carried no ceremony, only silence. By the time Holmes returned to Baskerville Hall, the first pale light of dawn was bleeding through the heavy mist. The moor, though still half-shrouded, was slowly exhaling the tension of the night. Trees, once only silhouettes, began to take shape. Stones reappeared like forgotten monuments. Even the wind returned, whispering faintly across the land, as if the moor itself had survived something unspeakable. Inside the hall, the hearth had been lit, and the first firelight danced across the polished wood and somber tapestries. Sir Henry sat slumped in an armchair, his head resting back against the high leather cushion. He looked older than he had a day ago, not merely tired, but worn from the inside out. Watson stood beside him, alert, though with the distant eyes of a man who had stood too long at the edge of something dark. Holmes entered without ceremony. His boots were wet to the ankle, and mud clung to the hem of his coat, but his eyes were clear, focused. He moved directly to the fire, holding out his hands to the warmth, but not speaking. The silence between the three men stretched. Not awkward, not tense, but necessary. At last Watson spoke. "You found him?" Holmes nodded once. "Or what's left of him?" Sir Henry sat forward. "You mean he's dead?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he knelt by the fireplace, took a dry cloth from the hearth shelf, and slowly began cleaning the mud from his boots, speaking as he worked. There were tracks leading out from the rear of Merripit House. Stapleton had already begun to pack. He knew the hound was dead, knew the plan had failed. Likely he watched the moor, realized the beast had not returned, and understood. He fled, in haste, not to escape justice, but to vanish. Sir Henry leaned forward. "He went into the mire?" "Nate." Holmes folded the cloth carefully and set it down. He knew its paths well. He had drawn them himself. There were routes only he trusted, crossing on narrow spines of dry ground between the deep pools. But desperation dulls even the sharpest mind. The tracks, they led directly to one of the most unstable regions. I found a narrow rise, 2 feet wide at most, where the grasses flattened. His prints ran along it, but halfway through they stuttered. The final impression was deep, unnaturally deep. Then, nothing. Sir Henry closed his eyes. The moor took him. Holmes rose to his feet, brushing dust from his trousers. No need for a trial, no need for a gallows. Nature rendered the verdict in its own language. He turned to Watson. "It's strange. The man who orchestrated every step of this affair, the theft, the manipulation, the deaths, ended with the most silent of exits. No body, no scream, just stillness." Watson moved to the window, looking out toward the morning mist. "Will anyone believe it? That he died out there?" Holmes walked slowly across the room and retrieved the small leather journal from his coat pocket. He laid it on the desk beside the map he had taken from the house earlier. "They won't have to believe. We have his notes, the training, the preparation, the routes into the mire. The journal proves intention. The map proves method." Sir Henry studied the items, but his hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingertip. "There's no satisfaction. I thought I'd feel some relief, anger, anything, but now it's over. I just feel hollow." Holmes's expressions. You're alive. That is not a small thing. Sir Henry looked up at him. And Charles is still gone. My uncle. He didn't deserve. No. A long silence, broken only by the crackling. Then Watson asked, what will happen to Merripit House? Will be searched. The authorities will find the phosphor, the coded lead, the pieces of the disguise, and they will understand in time what happened here. And Beryl? Watson asked, quieter still. Holmes glanced toward the staircase. She'll speak soon, when she's ready. And when she does, the truth will become undeniable. He stepped back from the hearth and collected his coat. There's one final thing I must do. Watson raised an eyebrow. Back to the mire? Holmes shook his head. No, the villagers? I'll speak to the magistrate and constable. Let them hear it from. They deserve the facts before the rumors twist this, though I suspect in time it will become just a tale whispered on cold. Holmes paused at the door, then glanced back with a faint smile. Perhaps, but if the legend remains, let it be only that. A legend, not a weapon. And with that he stepped out into the gray light, the mist parting as he moved into it, just another shape among the many, lost to the moor. The sun had not yet fully risen when Beryl Stapleton emerged from the guest chamber upstairs. Her steps were quiet but deliberate, as though she had only now remembered how to walk without glancing over her shoulder. Her hair had been pinned back hastily, and her dress, a dark, high-necked garment, hung loosely on her narrow frame, as if borrowed or hurriedly chosen. But there was no doubt in her bearing. Something in her had. Watson stood in the hallway, watching her approach with the quiet respect due a woman who had endured more than she ever should have. He said nothing, but his expression told her she was not alone. In the drawing room, she stood beside the cold fireplace, refusing a chair, her arms wrapped lightly across her chest as if trying to hold herself in place. Holmes waited with his notebook closed, pen still. He would not interrupt her. She took a breath, then another, and began. My name is not Beryl Stapleton, said quietly. My name is Beryl Garcia. I am, or was, his wife. He asked me to pretend to be his sister when we arrived in Devon, said it would be better for appearances, that the people here were provincial and might trust us more if they believed we were simple family. Her voice did not tremble, but it lacked any rehearsed. It was the sound of someone pulling memories out into daylight first time. I believed him. I followed him from South America to England. I thought he was brilliant, obsessed, yes, but brilliant. At first it was only insects, the moor, the books. Then came the inheritance. He told me he was a Baskerville, that his father had been wronged, disinherited. He spoke of justice, of restoring what was his by right. He never said murder. Not then. Holmes watched her carefully. But eventually, she nodded. I began to suspect. I saw things, the maps, the dog. He said it was just a hunting animal. He kept it away from me at first. Then the boots went missing, and he grew nervous. I asked him, and he lied, too. Her hands tightened. I wanted to leave. He said if I tried, he'd tell the authorities I was complicit, that I helped him bring the animal here, that I'd be arrested too, voice growing harder. But I wasn't afraid of prison. I was afraid of him. She turned her eyes toward Holmes. He watched everything I did, every letter I wrote, every step I took out. I couldn't warn anyone directly, but when Sir Henry came, I saw how kind he was. I thought, maybe if I said something just enough to frighten him away. She trailed off. You mistook Watson for Sir Henry. Yes, I thought it was my chance. Her voice broke, but I was foolish. Jack knew. He cornered me in the house that night and locked me in the bedroom for 2 days. He threatened to chain me in the barn if I ever tried again. She exhaled. So I stopped. I waited. I prayed for someone to stop him. And then you came. Watson, seated nearby, had grown still. Holmes finally spoke. You've done more than you know. Without your warnings, without your resistance, his plan might have succeeded. It's not enough. I watched him destroy lives. I let him destroy mine. Watson stood then. You endured it. That's not nothing. She looked toward him with something unreadable in her gaze, neither gratitude nor guilt, but something older. A quiet morning, Holmes stepped forward and opened the notebook. Would you be willing to make a formal statement? Signed? We will see to it that your name is cleared. She nodded. Yes. Do you have family here? No, but I have a brother in Lisbon. He's written for years asking me to come. Holmes closed the notebook. You'll go to him. She gave a small broken smile. If I can learn how to sleep again. Watson crossed the room and gently set a small package in her hands, a box wrapped in linen. She looked down, puzzled. It was recovered from Merripit House, he said quietly. Your things, some jewelry, papers, letters, I believe, from your mother. She held it with hands unmoving, then pressed it slowly to her chest. For the first time she cried, but they were quiet tears, no shaking, no collapse, just soft drops that ran down her cheeks and vanished into the folds of the kind of tears that do not ask to be noticed, only released. Holmes and Watson stepped back, giving her space, and in that still, fire-warmed room of an old manor, finally freed from its shadow, the silence was not one of fear or mourning. It was one. Later that day, with the last of the morning fog retreating from the moor and the air turning crisp and clear, Holmes requested they gather once more in the library of Baskerville. The fire had been freshly stoked, casting warm amber light over the dark wood and carved shelves. Watson sat opposite him with his ever-present notebook, while Sir Henry leaned forward with both hands on his knees, his eyes steadier than they had been since his arrival in Devon. Holmes stood near the mantel, not pacing. His energy had settled, but occasionally glancing into the fire as he spoke, as if the flickering flames helped organize his thoughts. We know now who the man was, his tone. Jack Stapleton was, in fact, Roger Baskerville, Jr., son of Roger Baskerville, Sr., the black sheep of the family. Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. But he was supposed to have died in South America. Precisely. That was the assumption, at least. His father fled England after several scandals and took the boy with him. It's recorded that both perished of yellow fever in Central America some 20 years ago. Watson leaned in. And yet, the son survived. Holmes gave a short nod. Not only survived, he reinvented himself. Roger Jr. became Jack Stapleton, a self-proclaimed schoolmaster, then a naturalist. He returned to England, carefully choosing a region close to his family's estate, but distant enough that no one would recognize him. Why not simply claim his birthright, Sir Henry asked? Because his father had been disinherited. The legal documents stripped him and his descendants of any claim. But if Sir Charles and yourself were to die without issue, the estate would pass to the next male heir, by default, through a distant, obscured line. Watson added, one the public had forgotten, but he hadn't. Holmes continued. Stapleton understood that to take the inheritance through legal channels would be impossible, but by removing the remaining heirs, he could assume a new identity, forge credentials, and, under a new name, claim ownership without question. Sir Henry exhaled sharply. He was playing a long game. Holmes's expression darkened. Very long. He first arrived under the pretense of studying butterfly, built relationships with the locals, even introduced Beryl as his sister, masking their marriage to appear more approachable, trustworthy. The locals admired him, thought him eccentric, yes, but harmless. Watson shook his head. And all the while he was constructing the legend, feeding it. Yes, that was the brilliance of it. He didn't just rely on the myth, he nurtured it. He made sure the locals still whispered of Hugo Baskerville, of the demonic hound. So when Sir Charles died, fear would be the first suspect, not a man with motive. Holmes crossed to the side table and retrieved a worn leather folder. Inside were several documents, maps, and letters collected from Merripit House. He laid them before Sir Henry. "This is your proof," he said. "Diagrams of Baskerville Hall, schedules of your routines, even clippings from Canadian newspapers. He studied your background before you ever stepped on British soil." Sir Henry opened one and read in silence, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't just murder," Holmes said quietly. "It was inheritance by extermination," Watson added. "He even used nature as a cloak, painting the dog, exploiting local superstitions, hiding the evidence in the open." Holmes's voice dropped, and he nearly succeeded. Sir Henry looked up from the documents, his face unreadable. "Do you think he believed in it? In the curse?" "No," Holmes said flatly. "Stapleton believed in one thing only: calculated power. The myth was a tool, just like the dog, just like Beryl." He paused. He weaponized what people feared most. There was a long silence. Watson, ever the human lens to Holmes's cold logic, finally said, "But in the end he feared something too." Holmes turned toward him. "Yes, exposure, consequence, and perhaps, though he'd never admit it, the mire." Sir Henry stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the moor stretched vast and quiet, a pale gold under the rising sun. Its silence no longer menaced him. It simply existed. "What happens now?" he asked. "You take back what's yours. Baskerville Hall, free of shadows." Sir Henry gave a faint smile. "I don't know if it'll ever be free of them, but at least now I know where they came from." Holmes nodded. "That's the first step toward home." The rain had returned by mid-afternoon, soft but steady, soaking into the already waterlogged earth of Dartmoor. Holmes and Watson, both in long coats, stood once more at the edge of Grimpen Mire, following a path barely visible to the eye, but sharp in Holmes's memory. They moved with care, their boots sinking slightly with each step, the mud grasping at their soles as if reluctant to let go. This was not their first visit to this place, but it felt markedly different. The urgency of pursuit was gone. There was no beast to hunt, no killer lurking in the fog. The silence was no longer tense. It was mournful. Holmes had returned to confirm something, not for the courts, not even for Sir Henry, but for himself. The trail began behind Merripit House, just as it had days before. Watson followed close, observing the land, noticing how quickly the landscape betrayed human presence. Even now, only days since Stapleton's flight, the prints had begun to fade. The moor was efficient in its reclamation. "There," Holmes murmured. He pointed to an area where the reeds had been trampled. "You see how the grass flattens here?" He passed through in haste, likely carrying supplies, maybe even money, but no food. He didn't plan to hide, he planned to disappear. Watson knelt beside him, careful not to disturb the pattern. Did he think he could cross the mire completely? He believed he could. He mapped it obsessively. His notes referenced safe ridges, dry lines barely wide enough for a footstep, and they existed, but only in certain seasons. After rain like this, he looked up, his gaze distant. They vanish. They moved farther in, following a narrow rise between two murky pools. Here the mud grew darker. Holmes stopped again. "These prints, do you see how they change?" Watson studied them. Wider, smeared, less defined. Because he was sinking, losing footing, struggling. Holmes traced the edge of one depression with his gloved finger. "This print. See the outline of his heel? It pressed deep. And yet, there's no next step." Watson looked ahead. Just open mire, glistening under the gray sky, the surface trembling with subtle movement beneath the shallow pools. "Could he have gone on?" Watson asked, already knowing the answer. "No. This is where he fell." Holmes stood slowly. He likely tried to crawl forward, thinking he could recover his pace. But the moor doesn't offer second chances. He turned and looked out across the open land. It's fitting in a way. The man who spent years hiding in plain sight vanished into the very place he believed only he could master. Watson remained. There was no satisfaction in this ending, only inevitability. Holmes stepped back from the edge. We'll leave it. There's no body to recover, no remains to examine. Let the moor keep him. It's justice enough. They retraced their steps carefully, following the same flattened grass, back toward solid ground. The rain had softened to a mist now, barely more than a cool breath across. As they reached the outskirts of Merripit House once more, Holmes stopped and turned to look back at the mire. "Do you know what I found?" he asked. Watson waited. He believed himself untouchable by fear, not even by nature. He constructed a world where he controlled every thread, and yet in the end he was undone by the very landscape he manipulated. The mire was always there, waiting, silent. He adjusted the collar of his coat. Sometimes nature renders the final verse, and nodded, then looked down at his own mud-slicked boots. And sometimes the land remembers what men would rather forget. They walked on in silence, the outline of Baskerville Hall rising ahead of them, no longer haunted, and behind them, the moor closed in once again, the last traces of Roger Baskerville Jr. swallowed forever. By the time they left Dartmoor, the skies had turned pale with approaching winter. The wind that swept across the heather no longer whispered secrets. It carried only silence and a breath of closure. The case of the hound, of curses and shadows, was over. The fog would return, of course, it always did, but it would no longer wear the shape of fear. Watson stood beside the carriage outside Baskerville Hall, his gloved hands resting gently on his walking stick. He looked up at the facade of the house. The stones, once oppressive in their gloom, now simply looked old, worn by years, shaped by storms, but no longer holding the weight of myth. Inside, Sir Henry moved quietly from room to room, his footsteps. He was not the same man who had arrived weeks before, full of confidence and curiosity. The ordeal had carved something out of him. He was safe now, yes, but safety does not always restore what fear takes. Watson had tried, in his own way, to comfort him over the past days. They'd spoken long into the night by the fire, sharing whiskey, remembering Sir Charles, and reflecting on the strange cruelty of legacy. Sir Henry never complained. He never cursed the moor, or the name he inherited, or even Stapleton, but the wear in his voice told the truth. He needed time and distance. Holmes, ever practical, had recommended travel. Italy, or Corsica, somewhere with sun, with wine and silence, the kind of place where a man might relearn the sound of his own heart when it wasn't racing. Sir Henry agreed. His trunks were packed now, and a ticket had been arranged. He would leave for the continent within days, with Dr. Mortimer seeing him safely to the docks. As the carriage readied to take Holmes and Watson back toward London, Sir Henry emerged at last. He walked with a steadier stride than Watson expected, and when he reached them, extended his hand without hesitation. "Thank you." Holmes gave a short nod. "Take care of your health. The worst is behind you, but memory lingers. Treat it gently." Sir Henry turned to Watson, and for a long moment they simply looked at one. Watson, a quiet, "You'll be all right." "I will, sir. Not today, maybe not for a while, but I will." With that, he stepped back, and Holmes climbed into the carriage. Watson followed, pausing only once to glance at the moor, still vast, still endless, but no longer menacing. As they rolled away, the house grew smaller in the distance, its towers fading into the rising mist. Several days later, back in London, Watson sat once again in his study at 221B Baker Street. The fire burned steadily, casting shadows across the bed and up the walls. Holmes was at the window reading the day's paper, making quiet remarks about a bank robbery in Whitechapel that had ended, predictably, in foolish capture. But Watson wasn't listening. His desk held the pages of his notes, observations, letters, impressions written over the course of their time in Devon. They were all there. The stick left at the door, The manuscript in the linen wrap, the sound of steps in empty corridors, the scream on the moor, and the dog, real, terrifying, but never supernatural. He opened his journal and began to write, not with drama or flourish, but with the clarity of someone who had seen behind the veil of a legend and found a man instead of a monster. The Hound of the Baskervilles, he wrote across the top of the page, and beneath it, in smaller script, an account of terror, calculation, and reason's triumph over myth. The pen scratched gently across the paper as he began to tell the story, not of a curse, but of a crime. And though his words were steady, a small part of him still felt the cold air of the moor, still heard the growl that had shaken the dark. He closed the journal gently after the first page, leaned back in his chair, and let the fire warm his. The fire at 221B Baker Street crackled quietly, casting a warm golden hue across the sitting room. Outside, the lamps of Baker Street flickered in the early evening fog, their soft halos glowing against the wet window glass. Inside, the air was calm, almost meditative, like the stillness following the final note of a symphony. Holmes sat in his favorite chair, legs crossed, his long fingers steepled under his chin. The violin rested untouched against its stand, the bow laid neatly across it. On the table beside him sat an untouched cup of tea and a small pile of notes, among them a from Dartmoor, inexplicably from the edges of Grimpen Mire, a reminder perhaps, or a final mark from the case. Now Watson sat opposite him, reading the morning's post, but Holmes had not spoken for nearly an hour. His eyes were not closed, but unfocused, his mind working not on a new problem, but still sifting through the act. Finally, this case was never about a... Watson looked up. No, Holmes. It was about... He leaned forward slightly, letting the firelight catch the edge of his voice was low and calm, not lecturing, reflecting. It was about how fear can be conjured, cultivated, fed like a dog in a dark barn, until it grows into something with teeth sharp enough to tear through reason itself. Watson closed the paper, setting it aside. He had heard this tone before, rare, contemplative. Holmes had solved the crime days ago, but now he was solving its meaning. Sir Charles died not from fangs, Holmes continued, but from belief, from dread. He was a man educated, rational, successful, but his heart failed him not from age, but from suggestion. He turned his gaze to the fire. Stapleton understood something most criminals do not, that the mind can be manipulated far more efficiently than the body, that a whisper in the dark is more potent than a dagger. That belief can kill. Watson said nothing, letting Holmes speak his thoughts unbroken. Each element of the plot, Holmes went on, was engineered not only for its physical effect, but its psychological. The note, the stolen boots, the phosphorescence on the hound's coat, all designed to cultivate legend, not to challenge logic, but to bypass it. He paused, thoughtful. And what disturbed me most, more than the dog, more than the deceit, was how effective it was, how easily people slipped into superstition. Even you, Watson, sharp as ever, entertained the possibility of something otherworldly. Watson smiled faintly. It was hard not to, given the circumstances. Exactly, because fear doesn't need proof, it only needs a stage. He uncrossed his legs, stood slowly, and walked to the window, drawing the curtain back. The street below was quiet. A constable strolled by, his boots clicking rhythmically against the damp stone. "You see," Holmes said, still facing the window, "we chase men with knives, men with poison, men with revolvers. But the most dangerous criminal is the one who knows how to use belief itself as a weapon." He let the curtain fall closed. Stapleton built a ghost with flesh and fire, and no one stopped to ask where the ghost had come from, not even the dead. There was another long... Holmes turned and looked at Watson with a quiet, unreadable expression. That's what unsettles me, that in a world of science, of facts and evidence, we are still ruled so often by shadow. Watson leaned forward. But we stopped at home. We ended it. Holmes gave a faint smile. We did. For now. He moved to the armchair again and sat down, this time picking up the violin. He adjusted it under his chin and drew the bow across the strings gently, testing their tune. And perhaps, he added, that's enough. As the first soft notes filled the room, slow, melancholic, and graceful, Watson leaned back, closing his eyes. The firelight flickered across the ceiling. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes like a memory. Inside, though, there was peace. Evening deepened over London, stretching its long fingers across the rooftop and chimneys of Baker Street. Inside 221B, the gas lamps glowed low, their soft hiss filling the silence between the notes of Holmes's violin. He played slowly, deliberately, not with performance in mind, but thought. Each drawn note seemed to pull a strand from the web of memory, of deduction, of the case now settled in his mind. Watson sat nearby in the armchair opposite, the remnants of supper cooling on the table between them. The fire was low, the room dim, but neither of them moved to brighten it. The darkness suited the conversation that was about. After several minutes, Holmes set the violin down gently and rested the bow across his. He sat quietly for a moment before he soft, but without. Watson, have you ever considered how little is required to unravel the human mind? Watson glanced over, intrigued but cautious. You're not referring to madness. No, Holmes, not madness, just disruption. A simple seed, if placed with care and the right weight of suggestion, can unmake a man far more quickly than force ever could. He paused, as if searching for the exact shape of the idea. In Dartmoor, he continued, we saw a man die from expectation. Sir Charles didn't fall because a creature attacked him. He fell because he believed it would. His heart failed, not from pain, but from anticipation of it. Watson nodded. You believe suggestion was the weapon? Undeniably. Stapleton understood psychology, perhaps not by study, but by instinct. He knew the legend, knew its texture in the minds of the locals. All he had to do was amplify it. Holmes stood slowly and walked to the fireplace, where he rested one hand on the mantel. His shadow stretched tall across the opposite wall. He used the hound, yes, but the beast was secondary. It was the fear of the beast, the anticipation, that did most of the work for him. Watson considered this in silence. Do you think many criminals operate this way? Fewer than you'd imagine, because it requires patience, foresight, and understanding of human fragility. He turned, facing Watson fully now. But the danger lies invisible. Suggestion doesn't leave fingerprint. It doesn't. It walks silently into a room, whispered, and leaves the victim to carry out the destruction themselves. He walked back toward the center of the room, retrieving a small glass from the sideboard, though he didn't drink from it. Stapleton didn't threaten Sir Charles with violence. He offered him a ghost, a phantom, and Sir Charles met it with his own. Watson leaned forward, elbows on, but the fear was justified. The hound was real. Yes, Holmes admitted, but would it have mattered if it wasn't? If Sir Charles had seen nothing, only heard a sound or seen a shape in the mist, he might have died the same. The reality was almost incidental. There was a long pause as they both considered that. Holmes continued, That's the real lesson, Watson. Evil doesn't always announce itself with rage. It often enters softly, with carefully chosen words, with stories, with memories. It builds its case not in courtrooms, but in dreams. Watson sat back slowly. And what do we do then? He asked. How do we fight something so intangible? Holmes smiled faintly and finally took a sip from the glass. We tell the truth. We shine light on corners where shadows breed. We dismantle fear with knowledge. He walked toward the shelves and drew out a single volume, a leather-bound copy of The Psychology of Fear, and placed it gently on the desk beside the case notes. "And we remained vigilant," he added, "because while one hound been silenced, the world is not short of men who know how to bark in its name, nothing more." He let the quiet return. Outside, the mist curled along the street. Inside, two men sat in warmth and understanding, having named the monster and watched it vanish, not with silver bullets or incant clarity. The late hours had settled gently upon Baker Street. The coals in the hearth glowed like embers at the end of a long day, casting their faint light over the familiar space that had witnessed so many strange tales unfold. The heavy curtains were drawn, insulating the room from the damp London chill. Holmes sat quietly at his desk, a stack of correspondence unopened, a fresh sheet of paper blank except for a single name written neatly at Watson. The detective leaned back in his chair, fingers laced across his chest, deep in thought. Dr. John H. Watson had once again played the part he always, not as a bystander, nor a mere chronicler, but as something Holmes, in his rare moments of honesty, valued far more: a man of heart, anchored to. The case of the Baskerville hound had tested the. Holmes had gone underground, masking his presence, trusting Watson to act without guidance. That decision had not come easily, but it had proven wise. Holmes rose and crossed the room. Watson sat reading quietly, his chair turned slightly toward the fire, his feet crossed in relaxed posture. The detective paused nearby, hands in his pockets. "I owe you a word," he said quietly. Watson looked up, surprised but attentive. "I've not often been generous with praise," Holmes continued, "but in this instance, I must acknowledge the depth of your contribution." Watson gave a modest shrug. "I merely followed your instructions." "No," Holmes said. "You followed your instincts. You gathered facts with care. You earned the trust of those around you, made observations I might have overlooked, and, most importantly, you acted with unwavering moral clarity when doubt would have paralyzed a lesser man." Watson lowered the book gently into his lap, listening. Holmes stepped to the mantel, resting a hand there, speaking not with flourish, but with rare sincerity. "There were things you did not know, things I withheld, and still, you never lost faith. You questioned, you pursued, you put yourself at risk not for recognition, but because it was right." Watson smiled faintly. "I had your voice in my head the whole time." Holmes looked over, a flicker of amusement. "Then I pity you." They shared a quiet laugh, an unburdened moment between two men bound not by necessity but trust. "Truly, Watson," Holmes added, "I may see what others miss, but you see why it matters. The facts are bones, but you give them flesh. You remind me that behind every puzzle is a human being, and behind every crime a cost." Watson looked into the fire for a long moment. "Sometimes I wonder whether I miss things, whether I'm too ordinary." Holmes, "What you call ordinary is precisely what makes you indispensable. Logic alone cannot solve all problems. Sometimes we must feel before we deduce." There was a silence, not awkward but full. The kind that settles between friends who understand each other perfectly. Holmes returned to his chair, picking up the violin once, but before he raised it to play, he spoke one more time. "I may have unmasked the villain, but you held the lantern." Watson said nothing, but in that moment he felt not pride, not glory, but something more enduring: purpose. That in the great machinery of Holmes's world, with its gears of logic and observation, he had been not a wheel, but the oil that kept it moving. The violin's notes rose into the soft dark, gentle and low. Outside, London breathed. Inside, the quiet lingered, comfortable. A week had passed since the final loose thread of the Baskerville case had vanished into the moor. The chaos had receded like a storm dissolving into the sea, leaving behind not devastation, but a stillness. Now, back in London, 221B Baker Street had regained its usual rhythm. slow, cerebral, always watchful, always the brass doorknob, polished by years of visitors with troubles they could barely name, caught the afternoon light. Inside, all was as it had been before Dartmoor called them. The Persian slipper returned to its corner. The unanswered correspondence sat in ordered disarray on Holmes's desk. Watson's medical journals rested under his inkstand, untouched since the early days of autumn. It was as if no time had passed, at least outwardly. But something had shifted. Holmes stood by the window with his pipe, the smoke curling lazily upward, his sharp eyes drifting. His violin was near but silent. His gaze was not hunting today, it was observing, idling in the comfort of knowing the seated. Watson, seated at the writing table, reviewed his pages from Devon, his notes now shaped into a proper account, clean, structured, and true. He had spent the last 3 days editing the chronology with care, trimming embellishment, resisting any urge to dramatize. The story was dramatic enough on it. He stopped mid-sentence and looked around the room, at the shelves stacked with books of toxicology and criminal psychology, at the fireplace where Holmes so often sat with closed eyes and open thoughts, at the collection of hats and walking sticks that told quiet stories of the men who once wore them. Back in Baker Street, the house breathed again, not with dread as Baskerville Hall had, but with familiarity, with quiet understanding. Holmes tapped out his pipe and crossed to the fireplace. He didn't speak immediately. He had no need. The silence between them was natural, unforced, like well-worn leather. Finally he said, "Are you satisfied with your account?" Watson glanced down at the manuscript and nodded. "I think it's one of the more unusual." Holmes smiled faintly. "And one of more tragic." Watson turned toward him. "Tragic, yes, but not unsolved." "No, Holmes, but tragedy does not always end with justice. Sometimes it merely ends." They both fell silent, reflecting not on the criminal they had outwitted, but the cost, the minds shaken, the lives broken, the man lost not only to death but to a lie he had lived so thoroughly it became truth to him. Holmes moved to the desk, glanced at the stack of unread mail. "It appears London hasn't changed. Never does. New names, old crime." Holmes thumbed open a letter from Scotland Yard. A theft in Soho. A missing banker. Nothing pressed. He returned the letter to the stack and looked once more at Watson. "You've written the hound into history," he said. "You've given it a name, a form. Do you think it will stay there?" Watson thought for a moment. "I think people will always believe what they want to believe. Some will say, we destroyed a legend. Others will say we merely chased it away." Holmes nodded slowly. "And some will invent new ones." The fire popped softly. Outside, a carriage clattered by. A boy shouted down the street. A dog barked at its own echo. London was alive, unbothered, undisturbed. Holmes crossed to the sideboard, poured 2 small glasses of brandy, and handed one to Watson. "To reason?" Holmes said, raising his glass. Watson met the gesture. "To light in dark places." They drank, and the warmth of the brandy settled in their chests, not as fire, but as reassurance. The moment passed, and Holmes picked up his violin at last. As he drew the bow across the strings, a soft melody rose, a simple theme, slow and restrained, echoing neither joy nor sorrow, but something deeper, resolute. And somewhere, far from the moor, the hound's final howl was lost to memory. The mist still rolls across the moorlands of Devon, shifting like a great ghost upon the hills, softening every edge, swallowing sound and stirring imagination. In the quiet hours before dawn, it is easy to imagine shapes moving in the distance, long-limbed shadows in the fog, perhaps even the low growl of something ancient waiting just beyond vision. But the truth is this: the hound, and the legend may still find live tales at taverns and firesides, has been disarmed. Its claws were not forged in hellfire, nor were its eyes lit by otherworldly It was a dog, a living, breathing beast conditioned to kill, a tool used by a man whose heart was colder than the moor itself. That is the truth. And it matters. Back in London, the case was filed, the documents sealed, and no further charges brought. With Stapleton presumed dead and the Baskerville estate restored to its rightful heir, the world moved on, unknowing. Only a few ever knew the full shape of what had happened in the mists of Dartmoor, and fewer still understood what it had truly meant. At Scotland Yard, the story became just another solved mystery, stripped of its mythic edge. Among locals in Devonshire, of course, the tale lived on. They still spoke of Hugo Baskerville and the peasant girl, of the bloodlines cursed by arrogance and cruelty. But now the tale was different, less certain, slightly frayed. Some remembered that a dog had been, others were sure it had been a demon. A few said the devil himself had been unmasked by a man in a long coat with eyes like. Time always softens the truth. Watson's account of the case was eventually published, not as a sensation but a caution. It was not the hound that fascinated readers most, but the man behind it. Jack Stapleton, or rather Roger Baskerville Jr., became an unsettling symbol, not of madness, but of brilliance twisted by desire. A man who could have lived in peace, but chose instead to cloak himself in legend, using the power of suggestion and the blindness of fear to build a weapon out of myth. In Baker Street, the rooms returned to their timeless state. Holmes's violin once again filled the hours. Clients resumed their stream. Lost wills, stolen heirlooms, strange letters. And though some of them were indeed perplexing, none carried the same weight, the same eerie pulse that had hovered over the moor. Watson, for his part, continued to write. But even as he chronicled their next adventures, something about the Baskerville case lingered, less like an echo, more like a fog that settled on the edges of memory. He understood, now more than ever, how thin the line was between belief and destruction. And Holmes? He never spoke of the hound again, not directly. But now and then he would pause during a consultation, staring out the window at a passing cloud or the curl of smoke from a neighbor's chimney. And Watson knew in those brief silences that his mind had wandered back to the moor, to the scent of damp earth, to the phosphorescent glow on coarse fur, to the moment when reason stepped forward and tore the mask off fear. That was always Holmes's true gift, not seeing what others missed, but seeing through what others believed. In the end, the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles didn't die. It changed. It became something else. A fable, a warning. Not about monsters that roam in darkness, but about the ones that live in plain sight, speaking softly, planting doubts. Because, as Holmes once said, it was never about the beast. It was about the belief in the beast, and how easily that belief can kill.